As the 20th century unfolded, the world stood on the brink of profound change, and in Italy, one man would rise to challenge the very foundations of the country's political and social order. Benito Mussolini, born in 1883 in the small town of Predappio, would come to be one of the most significant and controversial figures of his time. His life was marked by dramatic shifts, from early struggles with education and career to his rise as the leader of the Italian fascist movement. Mussolini's path was one deeply intertwined with the turbulence of Italy itself, a nation grappling with its identity, seeking a place among the great powers of Europe. His early years were shaped by the fervour of his father's political ideals and the influence of his mother's faith. Over time, Mussolini would move from being a rebellious socialist to a determined nationalist, charting a course that would lead him to the head of the Italian government. As we journey through the life of Benito Mussolini, we'll reflect on the era he shaped, the challenges he faced, and the impact he left behind. So let the steady rhythm of history guide you as we begin the story of Benito Mussolini's rise, his rule, and his legacy. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in the small town of Predappio, nestled in the northeastern region of Italy known as Emilia-Romagna. His birth came during a period of great social and political upheaval in Italy. The country, still a young nation after its unification in 1861, was trying to find its footing in a world dominated by established powers. This backdrop of national instability would subtly shape Mussolini's later rise to prominence. Mussolini's father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith with a strong socialist outlook, and his political beliefs would deeply influence his son's early years. Alessandro was an outspoken critic of the monarchy and the church, which were dominant in Italy at the time. His fervent political activism was a significant part of young Benito's upbringing. Mussolini's mother, Rosa Maltoni, came from a more devout and traditional background. She was a schoolteacher and instilled in Benito the importance of education and discipline. Rosa's devout Catholic faith and Alessandro's radicalism created a dichotomy in the young Mussolini's home, a conflict that would influence his ideological journey in the years to come. As a child, Benito Mussolini was often at odds with authority. He was a restless student, prone to rebellion and insubordination. In the classroom, he struggled with discipline, much to the dismay of his parents and teachers. His early academic career was not remarkable, and he was often expelled from various schools. Despite these challenges, Mussolini was deeply influenced by his father's socialist beliefs, reading extensively about political ideologies and the great revolutionary figures of the time. Mussolini's early exposure to radical ideas, combined with the deep-rooted political tensions in Italy, set the stage for his later transformation into a fiery nationalist. The ideas of socialism and revolution were imprinted on him from a young age. Yet the experiences of his youth would also lead him to develop a more complex and, at times, contradictory worldview. By the time he was in his late teens, Mussolini had begun to embrace his father's political beliefs, becoming an ardent socialist. His rebellious nature led him to distance himself from the more traditional religious practices of his mother, although the influence of Catholicism remained a part of his identity. He left home to attend the prestigious schools of Forlimpopoli and later the Military Academy of Modena, but his academic struggles continued. His aggressive personality, combined with his contempt for authority, made him a difficult student. During his time at the military academy, Mussolini faced constant disciplinary issues, and his teachers often found him to be unruly and defiant. These early experiences would leave a lasting impact on Mussolini's view of authority and power, shaping his future in politics and leadership. Though he did not excel in his studies, his time in the military academy gave him a sense of purpose and pride, and it marked the beginning of his eventual career in public life. Mussolini's early years were a tapestry of contradictions. He was both a product of his turbulent times and an individual who would seek to reshape those times according to his own vision. His family background, with its mix of radical socialist ideas and deep Catholic values, gave him a unique perspective on the world, one that would evolve over the years as he became increasingly involved in Italy's political sphere. As Mussolini transitioned from boyhood into early adulthood, he continued to be drawn to the world of politics. His early experiences with failure and rejection would eventually fuel his determination to prove himself. By the time he left the military academy in the early 1900s, Mussolini had already begun to develop the sense of self-assuredness and determination that would become a hallmark of his character. The young Mussolini's exposure to the turbulent political environment of Italy, combined with his rebellious nature and early experiences with authority, would play a significant role in his later rise to power. While Italy was still trying to find its place in the world, Mussolini was already laying the groundwork for his future role as one of the most influential and controversial leaders of the 20th century. His personal journey, marked by early struggles and ideological conflicts, would soon evolve into a political movement that would change the course of Italian and world history. As he moved into his early adulthood, Mussolini began to leave his mark on Italy's political scene, starting with his immersion in socialist circles. His time in Switzerland, where he lived for several years, would expose him to more radical ideologies and would deepen his commitment to the socialist cause. Yet, it was during these formative years that Mussolini's worldview began to shift, a shift that would eventually lead him to abandon socialism in favour of the fascist ideology he would become famous for. At this stage in his life, Mussolini's story is one of a young man in search of meaning and purpose, struggling with the contradictions of his upbringing, his early academic failures, and his experiences in the military. He was already a man of conviction, eager to make his mark on the world, though he had yet to discover the path that would lead him to political fame and power. In the coming years, Mussolini would transform from a young, impetuous socialist into the authoritarian leader who would shape the course of Italian history. But for now, he was just one more young man navigating the challenges of early adulthood, driven by the echoes of his past and the uncertain future ahead. Benito Mussolini's early years were defined by contradictions and a deep sense of rebellion, shaping the man who would later come to dominate Italy. Raised in a small town nestled in the heart of Emilia-Romagna, Mussolini's childhood was not one of stability, but rather of constant tension between his parents' contrasting ideologies. His father, Alessandro, was a passionate socialist, an outspoken critic of the monarchy and the Catholic Church. His mother, Rosa, a devout Catholic, held more traditional conservative values. In this environment, Mussolini's early years would be filled with a struggle to reconcile these opposing influences, which would leave a lasting mark on his later political career. As a young boy, Mussolini was known for his fierce independence and restless energy. His temper, inherited from his father, made him a difficult child to control. He was frequently at odds with authority figures, and his rebellious nature would become one of the defining characteristics of his early life. His father encouraged his independence, allowing him to explore his own ideas and question the status quo, while his mother urged him to follow a more conventional path in life, rooted in faith and discipline. This created a turbulent but formative childhood environment, where Mussolini was often caught between his father's radical ideas and his mother's more traditional values. Despite his rebellious spirit, Mussolini was also deeply curious about the world around him. From a young age, he developed a thirst for knowledge that would become one of his defining traits. His education, however, was marked by challenges. He struggled academically, particularly in subjects that required discipline and structure. Mussolini's early school years were less than stellar, with reports describing him as a difficult and sometimes disruptive student. His teachers noted his intelligence, but his inability to conform to the traditional structures of education made him a poor student in their eyes. At the age of 9, Mussolini was sent to attend the school in Forlimpopoli, a neighbouring town. It was there that he first began to show signs of the political convictions that would shape his later life. In his early teenage years, Mussolini read voraciously, immersing himself in the works of socialist thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. His exposure to these radical ideas was due in part to his father's influence, who was an outspoken advocate for socialism and revolution. Mussolini's passion for these ideas grew stronger as he matured, and he soon became a vocal advocate for socialist causes. His rebellious nature found an outlet in his commitment to socialism, and he began to see himself as a champion of the working class. However, his time in Forlimpopoli was not without its difficulties. Mussolini's defiance toward authority continued to be a problem in his schooling, and he often clashed with teachers and classmates alike. His teachers described him as a talented but difficult student, prone to outbursts and impulsive behaviour. He struggled with the structure of traditional education, and his academic progress was slow, despite his evident intelligence. This early academic failure would later become a recurring theme in Mussolini's life, as he would often find himself in conflict with institutions that demanded conformity and discipline. At the age of 14, Mussolini moved to the town of Faenza, where he attended the prestigious boarding school of the Salesian Fathers. Here, his academic struggles continued, but he also became more deeply involved in political activism. Mussolini's exposure to socialist thought was reinforced during his time at Faenza, where he became increasingly disillusioned with the authority figures around him. The rigid discipline of the Salesian school did little to temper his rebellious nature. He was often at odds with the priests and administrators, who tried to instill in him a sense of obedience and religious piety. Mussolini, however, was determined to follow his own path and resisted any attempts to force him into conformity. Mussolini's relationship with religion was one of complexity and contradiction. While his mother's Catholic faith played a significant role in his upbringing, Mussolini's early experiences at the Salesian school caused him to question the power and influence of the church. He came to see the church as an obstacle to the kind of radical change he envisioned for Italy. This rejection of religious authority, combined with his growing admiration for socialist ideas, set the stage for Mussolini's eventual departure from Catholicism and his embrace of more secular, nationalist ideologies. Despite his academic struggles, Mussolini's time at Faenza marked a turning point in his intellectual development. He began to see himself as a man of destiny, someone who was destined to lead and change the world. His increasing involvement in politics, particularly in the socialist movement, gave him a sense of purpose that he had previously lacked. During this period, Mussolini also became more interested in the works of revolutionary thinkers and leaders, further cementing his commitment to socialism and his belief in the power of radical change. His early years were filled with contradictions, but they also laid the foundation for his later political beliefs and actions. In 1902, Mussolini left Faenza and moved to Switzerland to avoid compulsory military service. This marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one where he would be free from the constraints of Italian society and able to immerse himself fully in the world of politics. In Switzerland, Mussolini worked various jobs to support himself while continuing to read and write about socialist ideas. His time in Switzerland was a formative period, where he further solidified his commitment to socialism and began to see himself as a revolutionary figure. By the time Mussolini returned to Italy in 1904, he was a young man with a strong sense of political identity and a desire to make his mark on the world. His experiences in Switzerland, combined with his early struggles in Italy, had shaped his worldview and prepared him for the path he would soon take. Mussolini was no longer the rebellious schoolboy who struggled with authority. He was now a man with a clear political vision and the determination to pursue it, no matter the cost. As Mussolini entered adulthood, he was ready to embark on a political career that would take him to the highest echelons of power in Italy. His early education, marked by rebellion, failure, and ideological growth, had prepared him for the challenges ahead. But the path to power would not be easy. Mussolini would face numerous obstacles and conflicts, both within himself and with the political establishment. His story was only beginning, and the next chapters of his life would be shaped by the same fierce determination and rebellious spirit that defined his early years. Benito Mussolini's upbringing was a complex interplay of contrasting influences, shaping his character and later political ideologies. While his father, Alessandro, was a passionate socialist and revolutionary, his mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a deeply religious and devout Catholic. This dynamic in Mussolini's home created a sense of tension and contradiction within him from an early age, a tension that would persist throughout his life. Alessandro Mussolini was a fervent advocate for socialism and anti-monarchism, deeply committed to the idea of radical change in Italy. As a blacksmith, he worked tirelessly to support the socialist cause, often engaging in political activism that put him at odds with the conservative forces of the time. His views were shaped by a profound belief in the working class and the need to overthrow the aristocracy and monarchy that dominated Italy. For Alessandro, socialism was not just a political ideology. It was a moral and ethical imperative. His influence on young Benito was profound, and it sparked in him a lifelong interest in political theory and social change. However, Benito's mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a woman of a very different character. A devout Catholic and a schoolteacher, Rosa embodied the values of religious piety, discipline, and order. She believed firmly in the importance of education and moral guidance, advocating for a life led by faith and integrity. In contrast to her husband's radicalism, Rosa's conservative beliefs were rooted in her deep commitment to the Catholic Church and its teachings. She did everything she could to instill in Benito the values of obedience and respect for authority, even as his father's influence led him toward rebellion. This duality within Mussolini's household was the backdrop of his childhood. While Alessandro's revolutionary spirit encouraged Benito's rebelliousness and questioning of authority, Rosa's strong moral compass and emphasis on faith provided a sense of stability and discipline. Young Benito, caught between these two opposing forces, struggled to reconcile his father's radical ideals with his mother's religious devotion. As he grew older, this internal conflict only intensified, leaving him with a sense of tension that would characterize much of his life. Mussolini's relationship with his father was one of admiration mixed with resentment. He greatly admired Alessandro's commitment to social justice and his courage in speaking out against the prevailing political order. However, the radicalism of his father often clashed with Benito's more personal ambitions and desire for recognition. Mussolini later reflected that he had inherited much of his father's rebelliousness, but lacked his father's ability to achieve lasting political success. The young Mussolini was determined to rise above the struggles that had marked his father's life and make a name for himself on the national stage. His mother, on the other hand, provided the stability and intellectual grounding that would help shape Mussolini's early education. Rosa, though deeply religious, was also a woman of intellect. As a teacher, she valued education and self-discipline, qualities she tried to instill in her son. She was the one who pushed Benito to improve his academic performance, even as he struggled in school. Rosa's emphasis on discipline and order provided the counterbalance to the revolutionary chaos introduced by his father. While Mussolini's early academic career was marked by failure, his mother's influence would help him build the foundation for his later intellectual development. Despite the opposing forces at play in Mussolini's household, both his parents left an indelible mark on his character. Alessandro's radicalism gave him the tools for political thinking and the courage to challenge authority, while Rosa's conservatism and emphasis on education laid the groundwork for his intellectual growth. This blend of opposing influences made Mussolini a complex figure, driven by the desire to reform Italy and the world, yet constantly torn between the revolutionary ideas of his father and the moral teachings of his mother. In many ways, Mussolini's relationship with his parents mirrored the larger political tensions in Italy during his formative years. Italy, still in the process of unification and grappling with its identity as a modern nation, was itself torn between conservative forces rooted in the church and monarchy, and the more radical socialist and nationalist movements that were beginning to emerge. Mussolini's family was a microcosm of these larger struggles, and his early experiences with his parents provided him with the ideological tools to navigate the complex political landscape of Italy. As Mussolini grew older, he increasingly identified with his father's socialist beliefs, rejecting the traditionalism of his mother and the Catholic Church. However, this ideological shift did not come without its own challenges. Mussolini's rejection of his mother's faith and his embrace of socialist ideas would lead to a deep internal conflict, as he struggled to reconcile his growing commitment to socialism with the moral values instilled in him by his mother. This struggle would later manifest in Mussolini's shift toward nationalism, as he sought to build a political movement that could unite Italy under a single banner, transcending the divisions between socialism and conservatism. The tension between his parents' opposing ideologies was not only an intellectual struggle but also an emotional one. Mussolini's relationship with his parents was complicated, marked by admiration, love, and resentment. His father's radicalism, while inspiring, often left Benito feeling as though his father's ideals were unattainable. His mother's religious values, though comforting, represented an authority that Mussolini was determined to reject in favour of a more secular and revolutionary path. This emotional turmoil would play a significant role in shaping Mussolini's later political career, driving him to seek power and recognition, while grappling with his personal identity. Mussolini's early experiences with his family were foundational in shaping his view of authority, power, and ideology. While his father's socialist influence inspired his early political activism, his mother's Catholic values instilled in him a respect for discipline and order. These contrasting influences created a complex figure, one who would later become a leader determined to reshape Italy according to his vision. Mussolini's family background was a crucial part of his personal journey, and the tensions within his home would ultimately shape his political career and the legacy he would leave behind. In 1902, at the age of 19, Benito Mussolini left his home in Italy and moved to Switzerland, a decision that would mark the beginning of a significant turning point in his life. This move was partly motivated by the desire to avoid compulsory military service in Italy, but it also provided Mussolini with the opportunity to escape the political and personal tensions he'd been experiencing in his homeland. Switzerland at this time was a neutral country, politically stable and home to a diverse array of political ideologies, including those that would shape Mussolini's future views. Upon arriving in Switzerland, Mussolini initially struggled to find his footing. Lacking financial resources, he worked a variety of odd jobs to support himself. He worked as labourer, a schoolteacher, and even as a clerk in a hotel. Despite these humble beginnings, Mussolini found Switzerland to be a fertile ground for political and intellectual growth. It was in this environment that Mussolini began to refine his political thoughts and adopt more radical views that would ultimately lead him down the path of fascism. Switzerland was a place where ideas flourished, and Mussolini immersed himself in political theory, particularly the writings of revolutionary thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. During his time in Switzerland, Mussolini became increasingly involved in socialist circles. It was in the working-class district of cities like Zurich and Geneva that Mussolini found his ideological home. He joined various socialist groups and began writing for socialist newspapers, becoming an outspoken advocate for the working class and the rights of the oppressed. He also began to develop his unique style of political writing, marked by fiery rhetoric and a commitment to social change. Mussolini's involvement in socialist politics was not simply intellectual, it was also deeply personal. He identified with the struggles of the working class and saw himself as part of a larger movement aimed at overthrowing the social order. While Mussolini was deeply involved in socialist politics, he was not yet the nationalist figure he would become. His time in Switzerland was marked by an unwavering belief in the need for revolution to bring about social and political change. He believed that the existing political structure in Italy, and in Europe more broadly, was corrupt and needed to be replaced. Mussolini's writings during this period reflect a deep commitment to Marxist principles, but they also reveal his growing impatience with the slow pace of change. He criticized the Italian Socialist Party for what he saw as its lack of action and its failure to fully embrace revolutionary tactics. It was also during his time in Switzerland that Mussolini's character began to shift toward the more authoritarian style that would define his later years. While his socialist beliefs remained strong, Mussolini started to question the role of democracy and parliamentary systems in bringing about change. He began to see the democratic process as ineffective and inefficient, believing that the revolution could only be achieved through strong, centralized leadership. This shift toward authoritarianism would become a key feature of Mussolini's later ideology, and it would lay the groundwork for the creation of the fascist movement. Mussolini's time in Switzerland was also marked by his growing disdain for the political establishment, both in Italy and beyond. He criticized not only the conservative forces in Italy, but also the moderate socialists and the ruling elites of Europe. Mussolini believed that these groups were complicit in the social and political injustices of the time, and he saw himself as a champion of the people who could bring about real change. His time in Switzerland solidified his belief that radical action, not gradual reform, was the only way to achieve social justice. In addition to his political work, Mussolini began to develop a more personal sense of ambition during his time in Switzerland. While his father's radicalism had instilled in him a desire to challenge the status quo, Mussolini began to see himself as a potential leader of the revolutionary movement. He saw in himself the qualities of a leader, a strong will, a powerful voice, and a determination to change the world. This belief in his own leadership potential would eventually become a defining feature of his character, fueling his rise to power in Italy. Mussolini's life in Switzerland was not without its challenges. He faced constant financial difficulties, and his political activities often led to conflict with the authorities. At one point, he was even briefly imprisoned for his involvement in political protests. However, these hardships only seemed to strengthen Mussolini's resolve. He became more determined than ever to pursue his revolutionary goals, and his time in Switzerland was a critical period of self-discovery that shaped his future path. By 1904, Mussolini had begun to gain a reputation as a rising figure within the socialist movement. He returned to Italy, where he would continue to build on the political ideas he had developed during his time abroad. Although he had left Switzerland behind, the intellectual and political influences he encountered there would continue to shape his views for years to come. His experiences in Switzerland had turned him into a committed socialist revolutionary, but they also planted the seeds of the authoritarian nationalist ideology that would later define his fascist movement. It was in Italy that Mussolini would truly begin to make his mark on the political scene. He took up writing for socialist newspapers and soon became an influential figure within the Italian Socialist Party. But his increasing frustration with the party's reluctance to take radical action led him to break away and form his own movement. Mussolini's early years in Switzerland were a crucial time in his life, as they marked the development of the political ideas that would later define his rise to power. His experiences in Switzerland provided the ideological foundation for his later political career, and his time there shaped the trajectory of his life in ways that would resonate throughout his future endeavours. Mussolini's journey from a struggling labourer in Switzerland to a political figure with a clear vision for the future was a testament to his determination and ambition. His time in Switzerland was not just a period of political development, it was also a time of personal growth. He learned to navigate the complexities of political life, and he began to see himself as a leader with the potential to change the course of history. His experiences in Switzerland would shape his future and lay the groundwork for his eventual rise to power in Italy. After spending several formative years in Switzerland, Benito Mussolini returned to Italy in 1904 at the age of 21. His time abroad had allowed him to refine his revolutionary ideas and strengthen his commitment to socialism. However, it was in Italy that Mussolini would truly begin to make a name for himself within the political landscape. His return to his homeland marked the beginning of his rise in the Italian Socialist Party, PSI, and the start of his transformation into a key figure in Italian politics. Mussolini initially settled in the northern city of Milan, where he took up a role as a writer and editor for socialist newspapers. He had already gained some recognition in Switzerland for his political writing, and his return to Italy provided an opportunity for him to continue his work as a journalist. His passion for writing, combined with his sharp intellect and fiery rhetoric, quickly attracted attention. He began to publish articles in which he advocated for workers' rights, the overthrow of the existing political system, and the establishment of a socialist government in Italy. At this stage in his life, Mussolini was deeply committed to the ideals of socialism and revolution. He criticised the Italian government, which he saw as corrupt and oppressive, and condemned the conservative political forces that dominated the country. He argued that Italy's political elite, led by the monarchy and the Catholic Church, was preventing the working class from achieving its full potential. Mussolini's writings reflected his belief that only through revolution could Italy be freed from the grip of these powerful institutions. Mussolini's rise within the Italian Socialist Party was swift, and by 1910 he was already one of the party's leading figures. His ability to write with passion and clarity, coupled with his forceful personality, made him an influential voice within the party. He was elected editor of Avanti, the newspaper of the PSY, which allowed him to further promote his revolutionary ideas and expand his influence. However, Mussolini's leadership within the PSY was not without controversy. While he was committed to the cause of socialism, he became increasingly disillusioned with the party's leadership. Mussolini believed that the PSY was not radical enough, and that its leadership was too moderate in its approach to social change. He criticised the party for its lack of action, and its tendency to focus on parliamentary solutions rather than revolutionary ones. Mussolini's impatience with the party's moderate leadership grew, and he began to advocate for more extreme measures to achieve his political goals. This growing frustration with the socialist movement was compounded by Mussolini's belief that Italy needed a strong centralised leadership to bring about the kind of revolutionary change he envisioned. He began to move away from the more traditional socialist positions, embracing a more authoritarian form of socialism. Mussolini's growing support for a more dictatorial form of governance foreshadowed the direction his political career would take in the years to come. Despite his disagreements with the socialist establishment, Mussolini remained a prominent figure within the party for several years. His writings and speeches, filled with passion and conviction, made him a beloved figure among Italy's working class. He spoke of the need for workers to unite and overthrow the capitalist system, and he believed that the time for revolution had come. Mussolini's ability to galvanize the masses and his fierce commitment to his beliefs made him a powerful force in Italian politics. However, by 1914, Mussolini's political views were beginning to evolve. The outbreak of World War I would play a crucial role in this transformation. Mussolini's initial reaction to the war was one of skepticism. He was deeply influenced by socialist internationalism, which called for workers of all nations to unite against imperialism and war. Initially, Mussolini was opposed to Italy's involvement in the war, believing that it was an imperialist conflict that would only serve to benefit the ruling elites. However, as the war progressed, Mussolini's views began to shift. Mussolini's turn towards support for the war was driven by several factors. First, he became disillusioned with the idea of international socialism, particularly after witnessing the divisions within the socialist movement regarding the war. Many socialists were either pacifist or opposed to Italy's participation, but Mussolini came to believe that Italy's involvement in the war could be the catalyst for the kind of national rejuvenation he had long sought. He saw the war as an opportunity for Italy to assert itself on the global stage, and for the Italian people to unite under a common cause. Mussolini's decision to support Italy's entry into the war was a decisive break with the socialist movement, and it marked the beginning of his shift away from his earlier Marxist beliefs. He believed that Italy's participation in the war would provide the necessary backdrop for the creation of a new fascist political order. Mussolini's support for the war was also part of his broader vision for Italy, a vision that emphasized nationalism, militarism, and the need for a strong centralized state. In 1914, Mussolini was expelled from the Italian Socialist Party for his pro-war stance. The party's leadership condemned him for his betrayal of socialist principles, and Mussolini was forced to leave the organization he had once been so closely associated with. This expulsion marked a significant turning point in Mussolini's political career. He was no longer bound by the ideological constraints of socialism and was free to pursue a new political direction. It was during this period of political isolation that Mussolini began to formulate the ideas that would eventually give rise to fascism. In 1919, Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento, a nationalist and fascist movement that would lay the groundwork for the Fascist Party. The movement was initially a small radical group, but Mussolini's powerful rhetoric and the growing sense of dissatisfaction with the post-war order soon attracted a broad following. Mussolini's appeal was based on his ability to capture the frustrations of the Italian people, particularly the working class and the veterans of World War I. The war had left Italy in a state of economic turmoil, and many Italians were disillusioned with the existing political system. Mussolini's call for a strong authoritarian state resonated with those who believed that Italy needed a decisive leader to restore order and stability. The formation of the Fasci di Combattimento marked the beginning of Mussolini's transformation into a nationalist and authoritarian leader. His support for war, combined with his disdain for the existing political establishment, set the stage for the creation of a new political movement that would soon reshape Italy's future. Mussolini's rise in socialist politics, marked by his initial commitment to revolutionary ideals and his eventual shift toward nationalism and militarism, was the first chapter in his path to power. The year 1919 marked a pivotal moment in Benito Mussolini's political journey. After being expelled from the Italian Socialist Party for his pro-war stance, Mussolini was no longer tethered to the traditional socialist movement. This expulsion, which severed his ties with the leftist ideologies he'd once championed, allowed him to carve out a new path for himself, one that would lead to the formation of the fascist movement. In the wake of World War I, Italy was in turmoil. The country had emerged from the war victorious, yet its people were dissatisfied. The promise of territorial gains had largely gone unmet. The economy was in ruins, and political instability had reached new heights. The Treaty of Versailles had failed to deliver the rewards Italy expected, and many Italians were disillusioned with the ruling elites who seemed incapable of addressing the country's problems. The so-called mutilated victory left the Italian populace feeling cheated, while social unrest simmered in the streets. It was against this backdrop of national frustration that Mussolini sought to build his new political movement. In March 1919, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, or the Combat League. This was a radical group that combined nationalist sentiments with a call for a strong, centralized government, military expansion, and the dismantling of the existing political order. Mussolini's idea for the Fasci di Combattimento was not initially based on a rigid ideology, but rather on the desire to bring together various elements of Italian society: disaffected war veterans, disgruntled workers, and nationalists who felt betrayed by the liberal elites who had failed to bring lasting peace and prosperity to Italy. Mussolini's ability to galvanize people around his ideas was one of the key factors in the early success of the movement. He was an exceptional orator, and his speeches were characterized by passionate calls for national renewal and strength. He promised to restore Italy to its former glory, to make it a great nation once again. His rhetoric resonated deeply with those who felt betrayed by the government and were looking for a strong leader to guide them through the chaos of the post-war period. The fascist movement that Mussolini founded was initially small and fragmented, with the Fasci di Combattimento having limited influence. The group was made up mostly of former soldiers, students, and intellectuals who shared Mussolini's belief in the need for a radical overhaul of Italy's political system. However, despite its modest beginnings, the movement's ideas quickly gained traction in a country reeling from political and economic instability. Mussolini's call for a strong authoritarian government was seen as a solution to the chaos that gripped Italy, and many began to view him as the leader who could restore order. One of the key ideas that Mussolini promoted through the Fasci di Combattimento was the concept of corporatism, a system in which the interests of different groups in society, such as workers, employers, and the state, would be integrated into a unified structure. Mussolini believed that this would eliminate class conflict and create a more harmonious society. The fascists rejected both capitalism and socialism in their traditional forms, seeking to create a middle path that would reconcile the interests of different classes while maintaining strong central authority. Another core element of the fascist ideology was militarism. Mussolini emphasized the need for Italy to restore its military power and to assert itself on the international stage. His experiences in World War I had convinced him of the importance of military strength, and he saw war as a means of revitalizing Italy's national spirit. Mussolini's rhetoric increasingly focused on the idea of building a strong, expansive Italy that would lead in Europe and beyond. The early years of the fascist movement were marked by violent street battles between Mussolini's supporters, known as the Black Shirts, and the socialist and communist factions who were also seeking to influence Italy's future. These street clashes became a hallmark of fascist politics, with Mussolini's movement using force to challenge the authority of the existing political parties. The Black Shirts would go on to play a critical role in Mussolini's rise to power, and their use of violence and intimidation would become a defining feature of the fascist regime. By 1920, the fascist movement began to attract more and more supporters, particularly among the middle classes, who were disillusioned with the rise of socialism and communism in Italy. The middle class saw the fascists as a bulwark against the growing influence of leftist ideologies, which they believed threatened the stability of society. Mussolini's promises of law and order, as well as his calls for a strong centralized government, resonated with those who were concerned about the rising power of labor unions and leftist political movements. Despite the increasing popularity of the fascists, the movement faced significant opposition. The political establishment in Italy, which was dominated by liberal and conservative elites, viewed Mussolini and his followers with suspicion. However, Mussolini was a master of political maneuvering, and he was able to forge alliances with key figures in Italian society. He cultivated relationships with influential business leaders, military officers, and even the Catholic Church, all of whom had their own reasons for supporting his vision of a strong authoritarian Italy. In 1921, Mussolini formally transformed the Fasci di Combattimento into the National Fascist Party, giving the movement a more organized structure and a clearer ideological focus. Mussolini's leadership of the party became more solidified, and his control over the fascist movement grew stronger. He increasingly presented himself as Italy's saviour, promising to restore national pride and greatness through the strength of his leadership. Mussolini's political platform became increasingly focused on the need for a totalitarian state, one in which the government would control all aspects of life, from the economy to the media to the military. This vision of total control, combined with Mussolini's charisma and ability to speak to the concerns of the people, made him a powerful force in Italian politics. As the fascist movement gained strength, the existing political system seemed increasingly incapable of addressing the challenges facing Italy. Mussolini was positioning himself to take advantage of this political vacuum. In 1922, after years of building his movement and consolidating power, Mussolini would take the final step toward achieving his ultimate goal, the March on Rome, an event that would bring him to the pinnacle of Italian politics. This moment would mark the beginning of a new era for Italy, one in which Mussolini would reign as its dictator, shaping the country's future for years to come. By 1922, Italy was a nation on the brink. The aftermath of World War I had left the country politically unstable, economically fragile and socially divided. The post-war period, often referred to as the mutilated victory, had created a sense of profound disillusionment among the Italian people. Social unrest was rising, labour strikes were becoming more frequent, and political violence seemed to permeate the streets. Amidst this chaos, Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement had emerged as a growing force. The Fascist Party, now a formidable political entity, had gained considerable influence through Mussolini's rhetoric, the black shirts' violent actions, and the movement's promises of national rejuvenation. However, despite this growing support, Mussolini faced resistance from the political establishment, which was still dominated by liberal, conservative and socialist factions. Italy's ruling elites were reluctant to give Mussolini the political power he craved, and the country was still under the control of a monarchy that viewed fascism with suspicion. Mussolini, however, was not a man to be deterred by opposition. He recognized that in order to secure power, he would have to push the boundaries of political convention. In October 1922, with his movement poised to take control of the country, Mussolini launched a bold symbolic act that would change the course of Italian history, the March on Rome. The March on Rome was not a traditional military invasion, but rather a carefully orchestrated political demonstration. Mussolini called for his supporters to march toward the capital, and thousands of fascist black shirts answered his call. They converged on Rome, intent on pressuring the government into handing over control to Mussolini. The plan was to present the Italian government with an ultimatum: either accept fascist power or face an armed uprising. It was a dramatic gamble, and Mussolini knew that the stakes were high. On the morning of October 28, 1922, the fascists began their march from various parts of Italy, converging on Rome from all directions. Mussolini had strategically planned the event, ensuring that it would be seen as a unified and inevitable show of strength. While many fascists took to the streets, Mussolini remained in Milan, overseeing the proceedings from afar. He did not directly lead the march, but his presence was felt in every step of the movement. As the black shirts approached Rome, tensions rose. The Italian government, led by Prime Minister Luigi Facta, was caught in a difficult position. The military was divided, and the king, Victor Emmanuel III, was unsure of how to respond. Facta, who had initially opposed any concessions to Mussolini, was unable to quell the growing momentum of the fascist movement. His government was paralysed by indecision, and many in the military and political establishment feared that a violent confrontation would lead to even greater instability. Faced with this mounting pressure, King Victor Emmanuel III made a decisive choice. Rather than order the military to confront the fascists, he invited Mussolini to form a government. The king's decision to appoint Mussolini as prime minister on October 29, 1922, marked the beginning of Mussolini's rule over Italy. This was a momentous turning point in Italian history, and it was achieved without a single shot being fired. Mussolini's appointment as prime minister was not a result of an outright military victory, but rather a calculated political maneuver. The March on Rome, though it appeared to be a triumph of force, was in fact a strategic act of intimidation that exploited the political paralysis within Italy's ruling class. Mussolini understood that the government was weakened by divisions, and that his movement could capitalize on these vulnerabilities. The king's decision to offer him power was a recognition of Mussolini's growing influence and an acknowledgement that the fascists represented a force that could no longer be ignored. Once in power, Mussolini wasted no time consolidating his authority. He quickly moved to dismantle the fragile democratic institutions that had previously governed Italy. Mussolini believed that the parliamentary system was ineffective and that Italy needed a strong centralized authority to restore order and achieve greatness. His first steps as prime minister were to establish a fascist-dominated government and to suppress political opposition. He took immediate control of the press, limiting the freedom of speech and curbing the activities of the left-wing parties. One of Mussolini's key strategies in consolidating power was the use of corporatism, a system that sought to integrate various sectors of society, such as workers, employers, and the state, into a unified structure. Under Mussolini's vision, Italy's economy would be regulated by corporative bodies rather than by market forces or independent unions. Mussolini hoped that this system would eliminate class conflict and create a sense of national unity. While corporatism was presented as a revolutionary solution, it also gave Mussolini a greater degree of control over the economy and allowed him to align the interests of various groups with the interests of the state. Mussolini also moved swiftly to suppress dissent. The fascist movement had always relied on violence and intimidation to achieve its goals, and now that he was in power, Mussolini continued to use these tactics to maintain control. Political opponents, particularly socialists and communists, were targeted by the black shirts, who used violence to intimidate and silence those who opposed Mussolini's vision. The fascist regime began to solidify its hold on the country through a combination of coercion and propaganda, promising stability and national renewal in exchange for unquestioning loyalty to the state. Although Mussolini had gained control of Italy's government, his power was still fragile. The fascist movement had not yet fully consolidated its authority, and Mussolini faced significant challenges in dealing with both internal opposition and external pressures. His early years in power were marked by a series of political struggles, as Mussolini worked to solidify his position and eliminate any threats to his leadership. Mussolini's ability to navigate these challenges would ultimately determine the course of his rule. His charismatic leadership, combined with his ability to manipulate the political system and suppress opposition, allowed him to establish a totalitarian regime that would last for over 2 decades. The March on Rome, which had started as a political stunt, ultimately proved to be the key event that paved the way for Mussolini's authoritarian rule. It was a calculated move that shifted the balance of power in Italy and marked the beginning of a new era in the country's history, an era defined by Mussolini's vision of fascism. Mussolini's appointment as Prime Minister on October 29, 1922 was a pivotal moment in Italy's history. The March on Rome had been a highly calculated show of strength that led to Mussolini's ascent to power. But now, as Prime Minister, he faced the daunting task of consolidating that power and stabilizing a country in political and economic turmoil. His early years in office were characterized by a series of swift, decisive moves designed to solidify his grip on Italy. Mussolini was astute in recognizing that his ability to remain in power hinged on his ability to control both the government and the people. From the very beginning of his premiership, he made it clear that Italy would no longer be governed by the indecisive parliamentary system that had marked the post-war years. He took immediate steps to change the political structure of Italy, aiming to centralize authority and eliminate any challenges to his leadership. In doing so, Mussolini began the process of transforming Italy into a fascist state, where the government controlled all aspects of public life. One of Mussolini's first acts as Prime Minister was to set about dismantling the existing democratic institutions. He realized that in order to remain in power, he needed to break the power of Italy's traditional political parties. The Fascist Party, under Mussolini's leadership, began to dominate the government, and Mussolini worked quickly to establish a one-party state. Although Mussolini did not immediately abolish the monarchy or parliament, he rendered them irrelevant. He established a system of government in which he held absolute power, with all key decisions ultimately resting in his hands. Mussolini's grip on power was further solidified through his use of propaganda. The fascist regime was built on the idea of total control, not only of the political apparatus but also of public opinion. Mussolini's government worked tirelessly to create an image of him as the supreme leader, a figure who embodied the strength and unity of the Italian people. Mussolini's image was carefully curated, and his presence was promoted as a symbol of Italy's resurgence as a great nation. Public displays of loyalty, such as parades and rallies, became central to the fascist experience. The fascist regime's control over the media also became a key tool in Mussolini's consolidation of power. Mussolini moved quickly to censor the press and silence dissenting voices. Newspapers, radio stations, and other forms of media were brought under state control or were intimidated into supporting the regime. Mussolini's regime used the media to spread the message of fascism, glorify the nation, and promote Mussolini himself as a national hero. Through constant repetition of the fascist ideals and Mussolini's cult of personality, the regime sought to create a unified, obedient population that would support Mussolini's vision of Italy's future. Another key tactic that Mussolini employed to strengthen his grip on power was the use of violence and intimidation. The Black Shirts, the paramilitary wing of the fascist party, played a crucial role in silencing opposition. They were used to intimidate, harass, and in some cases violently suppress any political or social groups that challenged Mussolini's authority. Trade unions, socialist organizations, and even moderate conservatives who opposed Mussolini's vision were targeted. Mussolini's fascists used brutal force to ensure that no opposition could gain traction, and the regime quickly gained a reputation for its ruthlessness. This created an atmosphere of fear in Italy, where dissent was silenced and opposition was crushed through violence. Mussolini's rise to power was also aided by the weakness of Italy's political opposition. The post-war political system in Italy was deeply fragmented. Political parties were divided along ideological lines, and many were unable to present a unified front against the growing power of the fascists. The socialists and communists, though significant in number, were divided over how to respond to Mussolini's rise, with some factions advocating for compromise and others for violent resistance. However, Mussolini's charisma and his ability to manipulate the political environment allowed him to co-opt or crush much of the opposition before it could effectively challenge him. Mussolini's fascist state was also marked by his ability to appeal to multiple sectors of Italian society. He presented himself as a leader who could unify the working class and the bourgeoisie, the peasants and the industrialists. His government promised to address the grievances of the working class by cracking down on the power of labor unions and controlling the economy through corporatist structures. For the middle class, Mussolini's government promised stability and the restoration of order. For the elite, Mussolini offered an environment in which their power and wealth would remain largely untouched as long as they supported his regime. The consolidation of Mussolini's power was not solely focused on internal politics, however. He also sought to enhance Italy's standing on the international stage. Mussolini believed that Italy's strength should be measured by its ability to assert itself militarily and politically, both in Europe and beyond. He sought to build a new Roman Empire, one that would bring Italy back to its former glory. Mussolini's early foreign policy focused on expansion, particularly in North Africa, where he sought to establish Italian dominance. In 1923, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Corfu, a Greek island, in a show of Italian military power. This was followed by his plans for a greater presence in Ethiopia, a goal that would be realized in the years to come. Domestically, Mussolini worked to implement his vision of fascism, with policies aimed at shaping the Italian people into a unified and obedient nation. The government took control of education, promoting the fascist ideology in schools and universities. Mussolini's regime sought to instill in the population a sense of national pride and loyalty to the state. The government also encouraged large families, seeing the creation of future soldiers for the state as a central part of Italy's rejuvenation. Despite the initial successes of Mussolini's rule, his consolidation of power was not without challenges. His first years as prime minister were marked by political maneuvering, and the threat of rebellion from both the left and the right loomed large. Mussolini's authority was still fragile, and he needed to continue to secure the loyalty of key groups, both domestically and internationally. However, Mussolini's ability to navigate these challenges, combined with his charismatic leadership and strategic use of violence, allowed him to establish a totalitarian regime that would remain in power for over 2 decades. Mussolini's transformation from prime minister to dictator was swift, and the fascist regime's control over Italy grew increasingly absolute. By the mid-1920s, Mussolini had cemented his authority, and Italy had entered a new era of authoritarian rule, one in which Mussolini's vision of a strong, unified Italy would take center stage. By the mid-1920s, Benito Mussolini had effectively transformed Italy into a one-party state, with the fascist ideology embedded in the fabric of the nation. His rise from prime minister in 1922 to an absolute dictator was marked by a series of carefully executed political moves, the suppression of opposition, and a concerted effort to control all aspects of Italian life. Mussolini's regime was designed to instill order, unity, and strength, values he believed would restore Italy to its former glory. One of Mussolini's key steps in consolidating his control was the Acerbo Law, passed in 1923. The law allowed the political party with the most votes in the Italian elections to gain a 2/3 majority in the Chamber of Deputies, essentially giving the fascists the ability to dominate the political landscape. The law was a direct attack on the multi-party system, and it marked the beginning of the end for any remaining democratic processes in Italy. Although Mussolini did not immediately declare himself dictator, the law allowed him to effectively bypass the parliament and rule with greater authority. With the passage of the Acerbo Law, Mussolini's fascist party began to consolidate its grip on power. In the elections that followed, the fascists secured a dominant position in the Chamber of Deputies, and Mussolini's government became increasingly authoritarian. The transition to a fascist dictatorship was carried out with remarkable speed and efficiency, aided by Mussolini's keen understanding of how to manipulate the political system and eliminate rivals. The political opposition, including the socialists and communists, was systematically dismantled. Mussolini used his black-shirt paramilitaries to intimidate, beat, and kill political opponents. The threat of violence was ever present, and the regime used it to maintain control over both the streets and the government. By 1925, Mussolini had taken further steps to solidify his absolute power. He delivered a famous speech in which he declared that he was now the unchallenged leader of Italy. In this speech, he openly rejected the parliamentary system, which he had once been a part of, and proclaimed the establishment of a fascist dictatorship. Mussolini's rhetoric during this period was bold and unapologetic. He justified his consolidation of power by portraying it as a necessary step to protect Italy from chaos and instability. He framed himself as the only leader capable of saving Italy from the dangers posed by left-wing radicals and political fragmentation. With the declaration of dictatorship, Mussolini moved to eliminate any remaining political freedoms. He banned opposition parties and outlawed strikes. His regime began to control all aspects of Italian society, from education to the media to labour unions. Mussolini's control over the press became a cornerstone of his dictatorship. He ensured that all newspapers were either controlled by the state or forced to comply with fascist ideology. The Italian people were bombarded with fascist propaganda at every turn, with Mussolini portrayed as the infallible leader guiding Italy to greatness. The creation of the corporative state was another key feature of Mussolini's fascist regime. He envisioned an Italy where the interests of workers, employers, and the state would be harmonized under a single overarching structure. In theory, corporatism was meant to resolve class conflicts by organizing society into corporative bodies that represented different sectors of the economy. In practice, it gave Mussolini greater control over the economy and allowed him to align the interests of industrialists, landowners, and workers with the needs of the state. While Mussolini promised that corporatism would bring about social justice, in reality, it was a tool for the fascists to consolidate their power and suppress labour movements. One of Mussolini's central aims was to create a totalitarian society, one in which the government controlled every aspect of public life. This goal was pursued with an unrelenting drive as Mussolini sought to create a nation where fascism permeated every institution, every business, and every family. Mussolini believed that the strength of the nation depended on the unity and discipline of its people, and his regime promoted strict conformity. Children were indoctrinated into the fascist ideology through school programs, while adults were expected to demonstrate their loyalty through participation in fascist organizations such as the Italian Youth and the Fascist Women's Organization. Mussolini's regime also worked to create a cult of personality around him. He was portrayed as the embodiment of Italy's strength and unity, a leader who had restored order to a country torn apart by political and social upheaval. His image was everywhere, from statues and murals to newspapers and films. Mussolini presented himself as the Il Duce, the leader, a paternal figure who had saved Italy from disaster. The cult of personality was a powerful tool in Mussolini's arsenal, as it kept the Italian people focused on his vision for the nation and reinforced the idea that Italy's success was directly tied to his leadership. However, while Mussolini's fascist dictatorship brought about a sense of unity and national pride for many, it also created a climate of fear and oppression. The government's use of violence to suppress dissent became increasingly brutal. Political opponents were imprisoned or executed, and fascist thugs roamed the streets, intimidating those who spoke out against the regime. Mussolini's secret police, known as the Ovra, kept a tight grip on the population, monitoring and controlling any potential opposition. The regime's ability to instill fear in the population was a critical component of its success. People were forced to comply with the state, whether through coercion, manipulation, or the constant threat of violence. Despite the regime's authoritarianism, Mussolini's popularity remained high for a time, particularly among the middle class and the military. The March on Rome and Mussolini's promises of national renewal had won him the loyalty of many Italians. Mussolini's economic policies also seemed to yield some success in the early years of his rule. Italy's infrastructure improved, and Mussolini's regime implemented several public works programs aimed at boosting employment and stimulating the economy. His government also made attempts to address issues such as poverty and unemployment, though these measures were often limited in scope and effectiveness. Mussolini's early years in power were a period of rapid change and consolidation. His government moved swiftly to dismantle Italy's democratic institutions, replace them with fascist structures, and create a society in which loyalty to the state was paramount. The impact of his regime was felt throughout Italy, as Mussolini worked tirelessly to create a new Italy, one that was strong, unified, and firmly under the control of the fascist state. As Mussolini's grip on power tightened, his vision for Italy seemed to be on the verge of realization. However, beneath the surface, the foundations of his regime were beginning to show signs of strain. Mussolini's rule would face growing challenges, both from within Italy and beyond. By the mid-1930s, Benito Mussolini had firmly established his fascist dictatorship in Italy, and his focus shifted to expanding Italy's influence abroad. Mussolini's vision for Italy was not just one of internal rejuvenation. He sought to restore Italy to the greatness it had once known during the Roman Empire. This desire for territorial expansion was a key aspect of fascism, and Mussolini's foreign policy was driven by the ambition to create a new Roman Empire starting with Africa. One of Mussolini's central goals was to establish Italian dominance in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was one of the last independent nations in Africa, and Mussolini viewed its conquest as a way to expand Italy's empire and demonstrate Italy's strength on the world stage. For Mussolini, the invasion of Ethiopia was both a nationalist endeavour and a means to prove to the Italian people and to the world that fascist Italy could restore its former glory. In 1935, Mussolini began preparations for the invasion of Ethiopia, which he believed would be a relatively simple military campaign. Ethiopia, despite its ancient history and resistance to colonialism, was poorly equipped to defend itself against a modern European army. Mussolini's confidence was bolstered by the relative ease with which Italy had conquered other territories in Africa, particularly Libya, which had been taken under Italian control in 1911. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia began in October 1935, when Italian forces, under the command of General Pietro Badoglio, crossed the border into Ethiopia from Italian-controlled Eritrea. The Italian military, equipped with modern weapons and artillery, quickly began to overwhelm Ethiopian forces. However, the Ethiopian resistance, led by Emperor Haile Selassie, proved to be more determined than expected. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the Italian military, Ethiopian forces mounted a strong defense, and the conflict soon turned into a brutal, prolonged war. Mussolini's decision to invade Ethiopia was not only motivated by imperial ambitions, but also by a desire to assert Italy's position in the international arena. At the time, Europe was grappling with the rise of Nazi Germany and the increasing militarization of Europe. Mussolini sought to strengthen Italy's alliance with Hitler, and the invasion of Ethiopia was part of a broader effort to position Italy as a leader of the Axis powers. Mussolini believed that by acquiring Ethiopian territory, Italy would gain a strategic advantage in Africa, and his fascist regime would be seen as a dominant force on the world stage. The invasion of Ethiopia, however, was met with widespread international condemnation. The League of Nations, which had been established after World War I to promote peace and cooperation among nations, imposed economic sanctions on Italy in an effort to halt the aggression. The sanctions were ineffective, however, as major powers such as Germany and Japan either ignored them or provided covert support to Italy. Despite the sanctions, Mussolini pressed on with the invasion, and by May 1936 Italy had captured Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. The fall of Addis Ababa marked the official end of Ethiopian resistance, and Mussolini declared the establishment of the Italian East African Empire, which included Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. Mussolini triumphantly proclaimed that Italy had finally achieved the goal of creating an empire worthy of its historical legacy. The Italian victory in Ethiopia was presented as a major accomplishment for Mussolini and his fascist regime, and he celebrated the conquest as a demonstration of Italy's strength and resolve. However, the invasion of Ethiopia left a lasting stain on Mussolini's reputation. While the fascists celebrated the victory, the international community viewed the invasion as an act of aggression and a violation of international law. Mussolini's aggressive expansionism further alienated Italy from the Western powers, and Italy's relationship with Britain and France became increasingly strained. Mussolini's desire to be recognized as a leader in Europe led him into closer alignment with Nazi Germany, which ultimately set the stage for Italy's involvement in World War II. The conquest of Ethiopia also revealed the darker side of Mussolini's regime. The Italian military employed brutal tactics during the campaign, including the use of chemical weapons, which caused widespread death and suffering among the Ethiopian population. The fascist government promoted a campaign of racial superiority, portraying Ethiopians as inferior and justifying the use of violence as a means of civilizing the African population. These policies reflected Mussolini's belief in the fascist ideals of nationalism, militarism, and imperialism, and they were part of the broader fascist vision for a new order in which Italy was at the center of a global empire. The invasion of Ethiopia marked a significant moment in Mussolini's quest for power and prestige, but it also revealed the limits of fascist ambitions. While Mussolini was able to celebrate the conquest in the short term, the long-term consequences were more complicated. The Italian victory over Ethiopia did not result in the widespread international acclaim that Mussolini had hoped for. Instead, it isolated Italy from much of the international community, and the country's aggressive expansionism led to further tensions with other European powers. The conflict also highlighted the vulnerabilities of Mussolini's regime. While he was able to rally the Italian people behind the idea of empire and national glory, the consequences of the invasion were felt more deeply in the years to come. Mussolini's growing alliance with Hitler and his ambitions to expand Italy's territory would eventually drag Italy into the larger conflict of World War II. Mussolini's involvement in Ethiopia represented both a triumph and a turning point in his reign. On one hand, it cemented his status as a dictator with imperial ambitions. On the other, it demonstrated the challenges and consequences of such aggression. Mussolini had created an empire in Africa, but his actions would ultimately lead to Italy's involvement in a world war, the repercussions of which would shake the foundations of his fascist regime. By the late 1930s, Benito Mussolini's ambitions for Italy's role in Europe and the world had become ever more entwined with the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Mussolini's aggressive foreign policy and his desire to establish Italy as a dominant world power increasingly aligned with Germany's expansionist goals, paving the way for the Pact of Steel and Italy's eventual involvement in World War II. Mussolini's fascist regime had long flirted with the idea of aligning with Hitler, but it was not until the mid-1930s that the bond between the two regimes truly solidified. Mussolini had initially been skeptical of Nazi ideology, particularly Hitler's focus on racial purity and anti-Semitism. Mussolini himself had promoted a form of fascism that was more centered on nationalism, militarism, and the revival of the Roman Empire, rather than the extreme racial doctrines that Hitler espoused. However, by the late 1930s, Mussolini recognized that Italy's position in Europe was growing increasingly precarious. The failure of the League of Nations to contain the growing threat of Germany, coupled with Italy's own imperial ambitions in Africa, led Mussolini to reconsider his stance. The decision to forge a closer relationship with Germany was influenced by several key factors. First, Mussolini had long sought to establish Italy as a great power in Europe. His desire for an empire in Africa and his military expansionist policies required allies who could help him achieve these goals. By the late 1930s, Germany's successes, including the reoccupation of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria, made it clear that Hitler's ambitions were far-reaching. Mussolini saw in Hitler a powerful ally who could help him realize Italy's imperial ambitions, particularly in the Mediterranean and Africa. Additionally, Mussolini was motivated by a growing sense of isolation from the Western powers, especially Britain and France. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 had led to economic sanctions and diplomatic condemnation from both of these countries. Mussolini felt increasingly alienated by their reaction, and believed that aligning with Hitler's Germany would provide Italy with greater security and leverage in Europe. As Mussolini's relationship with Britain and France deteriorated, his desire for a closer connection with Germany became all the more pressing. In 1936, Mussolini made the decision to form a formal alliance with Nazi Germany. The two leaders signed the Pact of Steel, a military and political alliance that would tie Italy's fate to Germany's in the coming years. The pact solidified the relationship between the two fascist regimes, and Mussolini became an important partner in Hitler's vision for a totalitarian Europe. Though the pact was largely symbolic at first, it marked the beginning of a deeper collaboration between the two countries. The pact had significant consequences for Mussolini and Italy. First, it aligned Italy with Hitler's increasingly aggressive foreign policy, setting the stage for Italy's eventual participation in World War II. The fascist powers, united by their desire for territorial expansion and domination, began to work together in earnest to shape the political landscape of Europe. For Mussolini, the pact represented both a triumph and a risk. It allowed Italy to gain a position of power within Europe, but it also tied Italy's fortunes to the unpredictable ambitions of Nazi Germany. The alliance with Germany also had a profound impact on Mussolini's internal policies. By aligning with Hitler, Mussolini found himself increasingly forced to adopt Nazi-style tactics and ideologies. The fascist state under Mussolini's leadership grew more oppressive, with greater emphasis on militarization, control of the media, and the suppression of any form of opposition. Mussolini's relationship with Hitler reinforced the centrality of violence, authoritarianism, and propaganda in fascist governance. One of the most significant consequences of the Pact of Steel was Italy's eventual entry into World War II. Despite Mussolini's earlier reluctance to engage in a global conflict, he now found himself swept into the war by the dictates of his alliance with Germany. In 1940, as Nazi Germany was beginning its campaigns in Europe, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, signalling Italy's entry into the conflict. Italy's involvement in World War II, however, was not as successful as Mussolini had hoped. The Italian military was not prepared for the scale of the war, and Italy's initial campaigns were marked by failure. Italy's invasion of France in 1940, while initially successful, was quickly stalled, and Mussolini's attempt to secure Italian dominance in North Africa faltered as well. Mussolini's strategic decisions began to clash with the realities of modern warfare, and Italy's lackluster performance on the battlefield exposed the weaknesses of his leadership. Mussolini's decision to join the Axis powers was also rooted in his belief that Italy could carve out a position of power in Europe through military conquest. However, this miscalculation would prove disastrous for Italy. Mussolini's alignment with Hitler ultimately led Italy into a war it was not equipped to win, and Mussolini's reputation as a leader would begin to crumble as the war dragged on. The alliance with Germany also had a profound impact on Mussolini's relationships with the Italian people. Initially, Mussolini's regime had enjoyed significant popular support, but as Italy's fortunes in the war declined, so did the fascist leader's popularity. The Italian public began to see the consequences of Mussolini's alliance with Hitler, and many began to question his leadership. The economic strain of the war, coupled with growing casualties, fueled discontent among the population. Mussolini's earlier promises of national greatness were beginning to unravel. as Italy found itself mired in a devastating conflict. By 1943, Mussolini's grip on power had weakened significantly. The Italian military was in retreat, and the Allied forces had begun their invasion of Italy. Mussolini's relationship with Hitler had become increasingly strained, and Mussolini's role as a puppet of Nazi Germany became more evident. In July 1943, Mussolini was ousted from power by a coup orchestrated by the king and the Italian military. He was arrested, and Italy formally surrendered to the Allies. However, Mussolini would not remain in captivity for long. In September 1943, he was rescued by Nazi forces and placed at the head of the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state in northern Italy that existed under German control. As Italy entered World War II in 1940, Mussolini's dreams of a fascist-dominated Europe began to clash with the harsh realities of modern warfare. Despite the initial support he received from Nazi Germany and his early enthusiasm for military conquest, Italy's involvement in the war quickly turned disastrous. Mussolini had overestimated Italy's ability to sustain a prolonged military campaign, and the events that unfolded over the next several years would ultimately contribute to his downfall. Mussolini's entry into World War II was, in part, motivated by his desire to assert Italy's status as a major European power. The Pact of Steel with Nazi Germany had solidified Italy's place in the Axis powers, and Mussolini believed that by joining the war alongside Hitler, Italy could share in the spoils of victory and expand its territorial holdings. Mussolini had grand ambitions for Italy's empire, particularly in North Africa, where he hoped to secure Italy's dominance over key regions such as Libya and Ethiopia. He also sought to expand Italian influence in the Mediterranean, which he considered to be Italy's natural sphere of influence. However, Italy's military was ill-prepared for the scale of the war. Mussolini's military strategies were often overly ambitious, and the Italian army lacked the resources, equipment, and coordination to face the combined forces of the Allies and Nazi Germany. In 1940, Mussolini launched an ill-fated invasion of France, hoping to gain more territory before the fall of the French government. The Italian military's advance was slow and disorganized, and the attack did little to change the course of the war. The Germans, already making significant progress in France, quickly pushed through and left Italy with little to show for its efforts. The North African campaign, which began in 1940 with an Italian invasion of Egypt, also proved to be a disaster. Mussolini's troops faced stiff resistance from British forces, and the Italian military struggled to gain a foothold in the region. The situation worsened when the British launched a counter-offensive in 1941, pushing the Italians back and forcing them to retreat. Mussolini's attempts to bolster his forces with German assistance led to the involvement of Erwin Rommel, the famous German general, but even his expertise could not turn the tide in favour of the Italians. Italy's failure in North Africa was a humiliating blow to Mussolini, who had hoped to expand Italy's empire in the region. As the war progressed, Mussolini's leadership came under increasing scrutiny. His military failures, coupled with the growing strain of the war on Italy's economy and the suffering of the Italian people, led to widespread dissatisfaction. Mussolini's initial popularity was based on his promises of national glory, strength, and unity. But as the war dragged on and Italy's fortunes worsened, many Italians began to question whether he could deliver on these promises. The Allied bombing raids, the mounting casualties, and the economic hardships of wartime Italy took a heavy toll on public morale. By 1943, Italy was on the brink of collapse. The Italian military had suffered multiple defeats, and the Allies had invaded Sicily in July of that year, signalling the start of the Italian campaign. The Allied forces made rapid progress through southern Italy, and it became clear that Mussolini's regime could not withstand the onslaught of the combined military forces of the Allies. In response to the worsening situation, Mussolini's political rivals within Italy began to turn against him, and pressure mounted for his removal from power. In July 1943, a coup was launched against Mussolini by members of his own government and military. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, who had once supported Mussolini, now saw him as a liability. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini was arrested and dismissed from office. The Italian king appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new prime minister, signalling the end of Mussolini's rule in Italy. The fall of Mussolini was a dramatic and sudden turn of events. Once the undisputed ruler of Italy, Mussolini was now a prisoner of his own government. His removal from power was a direct result of Italy's military failures and the growing opposition to his fascist regime. Mussolini, who had once promised to lead Italy to greatness, found himself out of office and vulnerable to the forces of the Allied invasion. However, Mussolini's story did not end with his ousting from power. On September 12, 1943, Mussolini was rescued by German commandos in a daring operation. The Germans, who saw Mussolini as a useful puppet leader, transported him to northern Italy, where he was installed as the head of the Italian Social Republic, RSI, a puppet state controlled by Nazi Germany. Mussolini, now a mere figurehead under German control, was given the title of Duce once more, but his power was severely limited. His role in the RSI was largely symbolic, as Germany controlled the real levers of power. In the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini attempted to maintain a sense of authority, but his rule was increasingly a mere shadow of its former self. The war was winding down, and Italy was increasingly liberated by the advancing Allied forces. Mussolini's influence had evaporated, and the fascist regime he had built was crumbling. Despite this, Mussolini continued to hold on to the hope of a fascist resurgence in Italy. But by this point, his vision for Italy had become increasingly irrelevant. As the Allies closed in on northern Italy, Mussolini's time was running out. In April 1945, as the end of the war drew near, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Petacci, but they were captured by Italian partisans near the town of Dongo. Mussolini was brought to Milan, where he was executed by firing squad on April 28, 1945. His body, along with that of his mistress, was displayed in a public square in Milan, where it was subjected to further humiliation. The brutal end of Mussolini's life was a stark contrast to the triumphs he had promised Italy during his rise to power. Mussolini's downfall was not just the result of military failure. It was also a reflection of the failure of his fascist ideals. Mussolini had promised to restore Italy to greatness. But by the end of his life, Italy was in ruins, and his regime had left behind a legacy of violence, repression, and destruction. His alliance with Hitler had dragged Italy into a catastrophic war, and his inability to secure victory or maintain control over his own country led to his eventual demise. Mussolini's role in World War II ultimately sealed the fate of fascism in Italy and Europe, and his death marked the end of an era. On April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini's life came to a brutal and violent end. After being captured by Italian partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland, Mussolini was brought to the town of Dongo, where he was executed along with his mistress, Clara Petacci. The circumstances surrounding Mussolini's death were as dramatic and chaotic as much of his life. In the final days of the war, as the Allied forces closed in on Italy and the fascist regime crumbled, Mussolini's capture and execution marked the symbolic end of fascism in Italy. Mussolini's death was not a private affair. Following his execution, his body, along with that of Petacci, was displayed in Milan at the Piazzale Loreto, a public square. His body was hung upside down by the feet, exposed to the crowd in a show of public humiliation. This act was not only an expression of the hatred and contempt that had built up against Mussolini and his regime, but it also reflected the profound sense of revenge that many Italians felt after years of fascist oppression and the devastation of World War II. Mussolini's body was desecrated further, with onlookers spitting on it and even throwing rocks at it. The execution of Mussolini and the subsequent display of his body were powerful symbols of the deep sense of disillusionment and rejection of fascism in Italy. For many, the spectacle represented the final victory of the resistance movement, which had fought against Mussolini's regime during the war. It was also a statement that fascism, along with its ideologies of totalitarianism, aggression and imperialism, had been defeated both politically and symbolically. Mussolini's death did not immediately mark the end of the chaos in Italy. The country was in ruins, devastated by years of war, occupation and fascist rule. The end of Mussolini's reign left Italy in a state of political and social upheaval, with the country struggling to rebuild after the devastation of the war. The fascist regime that Mussolini had built had left behind a legacy of violence, division, and oppression. In the aftermath of Mussolini's death, Italy had to confront the difficult task of coming to terms with the fascist past and finding a way to move forward as a new nation. Politically, Mussolini's death marked the end of the fascist experiment in Italy. The Italian Social Republic, RSI, a puppet state established by Mussolini under German control, dissolved after his capture. With the fall of Mussolini's regime, Italy officially became a republic, with the monarchy and fascist dictatorship replaced by a new government structure. In 1946, Italy held a referendum in which the Italian people voted to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic. This transition marked the beginning of a new era in Italian history, one that would be defined by democratic principles and a commitment to rebuilding the country after years of fascist rule. Mussolini's death also had profound implications for the broader European political landscape. His execution marked the final collapse of fascism as a political force in Europe, and it signaled the end of the ambitions of Mussolini's fascist regime. However, Mussolini's ideas and the legacy of fascism did not disappear entirely. Despite the defeat of the Axis powers in World War II, fascist ideology would continue to influence political movements and extremist groups in the years that followed. Mussolini's life and death left behind a complex legacy, one that continues to provoke debate and reflection. In the immediate aftermath of Mussolini's death, his followers, many of whom had supported him during his time in power, were left to reckon with the consequences of his leadership. Some fascists continued to advocate for Mussolini's ideas, even as the country moved away from fascism. Others, however, distanced themselves from Mussolini's vision, realizing the devastation that his regime had wrought on Italy and the world. Mussolini's personal popularity among some Italians, particularly the middle class, military officers and veterans, did not immediately disappear, but his death was a clear indication that fascism had been utterly discredited. Mussolini's legacy was deeply divisive in Italy. For some, he was still seen as the man who had restored order to the country during the early years of his regime, bringing stability after the chaos of World War I. However, for the majority of Italians, his rule was marked by authoritarianism, violence, and the betrayal of the Italian people. Mussolini's decision to align with Nazi Germany, his brutal repression of dissent, and his role in dragging Italy into World War II left a deep scar on Italy's history. His legacy remains a topic of controversy and debate to this day, with some viewing him as a tragic figure and others condemning his actions as deeply destructive to Italy and to the world. Mussolini's death did not bring immediate closure to the larger struggle in Italy, but it marked a decisive end to an era of fascist rule. Italy's post-war period was a time of reconstruction, both physically and politically. The country embarked on a new journey as a republic, and Mussolini's death signaled the final end of the political and ideological system he had championed. However, his rise to power, His brutal dictatorship and his eventual downfall remain a significant chapter in the history of Italy and the world. While Mussolini's personal demise was swift, the broader consequences of his rule would be felt for years to come. The trauma of fascism, World War II, and the devastation caused by Italy's involvement in the conflict left a deep imprint on the Italian psyche. Mussolini's death, while symbolic of the fall of fascism, did not immediately heal the wounds of a nation ravaged by war. It would take decades for Italy to fully recover and for the wounds of the fascist era to begin to heal. Although Benito Mussolini's reign ended in 1945 with his capture and execution, his influence continued to shape Italy in the years following World War II. As the dust settled from the war, Italy found itself grappling not only with the physical and economic destruction caused by the conflict, but also with the political and ideological divisions left by Mussolini's fascist regime. Mussolini's legacy, both as a leader and as the figurehead of fascism in Italy, would remain a topic of deep division and debate for decades. After the war, Italy was in the process of rebuilding. Mussolini's regime had left Italy deeply scarred, with much of the country's infrastructure in ruins, its economy shattered, and its political institutions weakened. The decision to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic in 1946 was a clear rejection of Mussolini's fascist vision. The referendum that led to the creation of the Italian Republic was a moment of political rebirth, as Italians chose to move away from the monarchy and the authoritarian system that Mussolini had worked so hard to establish. This shift marked a significant departure from the fascist era, and many saw it as a chance to build a new, democratic future for Italy. However, the transition from fascism to democracy was not without its challenges. Mussolini's legacy of strongman leadership and centralized power left an imprint on Italian political culture, and the aftermath of fascism was deeply divisive. For some Italians, Mussolini remained a symbol of national pride and strength, someone who had restored order during the early years of his regime. For others, particularly those who had suffered under fascism or been part of the resistance, Mussolini's name remained synonymous with oppression, violence, and betrayal. In the years following the war, Mussolini's influence continued to manifest in various ways. On one hand, his ideological legacy was actively rejected and condemned by the new democratic government. The Fascist Party was formally disbanded, and many former fascists faced trials for their involvement in war crimes. The post-war period was one of intense political reckoning, with many Italians seeking to distance themselves from the trauma of the fascist era. However, Mussolini's ideas and the memory of his leadership were not so easily erased. The rise of neo-fascist movements in Italy in the decades following Mussolini's death demonstrated the enduring appeal of his ideology for certain segments of the population. Although Mussolini's fascist government was dismantled, elements of his political vision, particularly his emphasis on nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism, continued to resonate with some Italians. Neo-fascist groups, which sought to revive elements of Mussolini's regime, began to emerge in the 1940s and 1950s. These groups, though they never gained the widespread popularity that Mussolini had enjoyed, remained active in Italian politics, particularly on the far right. At the same time, Italy's left-wing parties and the partisans who had fought against Mussolini's fascist forces in the war sought to preserve the memory of the resistance and its victory over fascism. The post-war period was characterized by a fierce ideological struggle between the right-wing factions that admired Mussolini and the left-wing factions that sought to ensure that Italy never again fell under a fascist regime. The legacy of Mussolini was central to this ideological battle, with Mussolini's followers often portraying him as a misunderstood leader who'd been unjustly demonized, while his critics viewed him as the embodiment of fascism and tyranny. Mussolini's legacy also lingered in the realm of Italian culture. Throughout his rule, Mussolini and the fascist regime had sought to shape Italy's national identity, through the manipulation of culture, art, and propaganda. Fascist Italy had placed a great emphasis on nationalism and the cult of the leader, with Mussolini's image appearing in public squares, schools, and media. After his fall, Italy's new democratic government made efforts to distance itself from the fascist cultural legacy. However, Mussolini's use of propaganda, his centralization of the media, and his efforts to create a fascist aesthetic left a lasting impact on Italian culture, particularly in the realm of political imagery and public discourse. In the decades following the war, Mussolini's rise and fall continued to be a source of political debate in Italy. The question of how to remember Mussolini was a contentious one. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a renewed interest in Mussolini, particularly among historians and political commentators who sought to understand the rise of fascism in Italy. For some, Mussolini was a tragic figure who had been undone by his own ambition and miscalculations. For others, he remained a symbol of fascist oppression, an example of the dangers of totalitarian leadership. The memory of Mussolini was further complicated by the rise of far-right political groups that embraced aspects of his fascist ideology. These groups, though marginal, found a voice in the political landscape of post-war Italy. Mussolini's legacy was often invoked by these groups to legitimize their far-right positions, and his name continued to evoke strong emotions among both his supporters and detractors. Mussolini's family too played a role in preserving his legacy. His descendants, particularly his daughter Edda Mussolini, were active in Italian politics in the years following his death. Edda in particular sought to maintain the family's place in Italian political life and defended her father's actions during his time in power. Mussolini's family often found themselves at odds with the broader political climate in Italy, particularly as Italy embraced its new democratic identity and rejected fascism. Despite the lingering influence of Mussolini's legacy, Italy's post-war political transformation was significant. By the 1950s and 1960s, Italy had firmly embraced democracy and republicanism, with the legacy of fascism gradually giving way to a more pluralistic political culture. Mussolini's vision of a fascist empire was consigned to the past, and Italy worked to rebuild itself as a democratic nation, while also confronting the complex moral and political questions surrounding Mussolini's dictatorship. Mussolini's legacy remains an enduring and controversial topic in Italy today. Although fascism as a political force was officially defeated in the post-war period, the echoes of Mussolini's ideology continue to be felt in Italian politics, culture, and public life. His role in shaping Italy's modern history cannot be denied, but the question of how to interpret his legacy remains deeply divisive. For some, Mussolini represents a tragic chapter in Italy's past, while for others, he remains a symbol of national pride and strength. While Benito Mussolini is perhaps best known for his role as the leader of fascist Italy, his intellectual contributions and writings also played a significant role in shaping his political ideology. Mussolini was not only a dictator and military leader, but also a self-proclaimed political theorist, whose writings helped to articulate the vision of fascism that he sought to implement in Italy. His views on the state, nationalism, and authority were central to his rule, and remain important in understanding the broader fascist movement. Mussolini's political evolution can be traced through his writings, which changed considerably over the course of his life. Early on, he was deeply influenced by socialist thought, particularly the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. As a young man, Mussolini was an ardent socialist, and his first major writings were aligned with the socialist movement. His early views focused on class struggle, the overthrow of capitalist systems, and the creation of a workers' state. Mussolini's alignment with socialism in his youth was informed by a strong opposition to the capitalist elite, and his belief in the need for a revolution to change the economic and social structures of Italy and the world. However, Mussolini's political views evolved dramatically over time, especially during and after World War I. As Italy faced the devastation of the war, Mussolini became increasingly disillusioned with the socialist movement and began to shift towards a more nationalist and authoritarian ideology. His disillusionment with socialism came in part from his belief that the movement had failed to address the realities of the modern world. He began to question the idea of class struggle and saw it as an obstacle to national unity and strength. In place of socialism, Mussolini developed a political philosophy based on the idea of nationalism, authoritarianism, and the centralized state. One of Mussolini's most influential writings was his 1932 book, The Doctrine of Fascism, which he co-wrote with philosopher Giovanni Gentile. In this work, Mussolini articulated his vision of fascism as a new form of politics that rejected both liberal democracy and socialism. Mussolini argued that fascism was not simply a political movement, but a way of life, an ideology that sought to create a strong unified nation through totalitarian control. In his view, the individual was secondary to the state, and the state's interests should always come before personal freedoms or democratic processes. A key aspect of Mussolini's political thought was his belief in the totalitarian state, in which the government exercised control over all aspects of public and private life. Mussolini rejected liberal democracy and its emphasis on individual rights and freedoms. Instead, he argued that the state should have absolute authority and that citizens should subordinate their personal desires to the needs of the nation. The state, in Mussolini's view, was the supreme entity, and all citizens were required to serve it. Mussolini's fascism also emphasized militarism and imperialism. He believed that Italy, like other great nations, needed to expand its borders and assert itself on the world stage. Mussolini saw war as a necessary means of achieving national greatness, and he believed that the military was essential to the health and vitality of the state. Mussolini's ideas about the military were not merely about conquest, but about creating a unified national spirit. He saw the military as a force that could unite the country and instill discipline, strength, and patriotism in the Italian people. Another central tenet of Mussolini's political thought was the idea of corporatism. Mussolini rejected both capitalism and socialism in their traditional forms, believing that both were inadequate for achieving a harmonious society. Instead, he promoted corporatism as a system in which society was organized into different corporations or interest groups, such as workers, employers, and the state. These corporations would work together to resolve social and economic issues under the guidance of the government. The goal of corporatism was to eliminate class conflict and create a more unified, efficient society. In practice, however, corporatism served as a tool for Mussolini to strengthen his control over the economy and suppress independent labor movements. Mussolini's writings also reflect his anti-communism and anti-liberalism. He was deeply opposed to the spread of Marxism and communist revolutions, particularly in the wake of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Mussolini believed that communism posed a direct threat to national unity and the stability of the state. He saw the rise of socialism and communism as signs of societal decay and believed that the fascist state was the antidote to these ideologies. He also rejected the liberal values of democracy and individualism, arguing that they were weak and divisive. For Mussolini, the strength of the nation could only be achieved through a strong, unified government that placed the needs of the state above individual rights. Throughout his political career, Mussolini also made extensive use of rhetoric and propaganda to promote his ideas. He was a master of public speaking and used his speeches to inspire and manipulate the Italian public. His ability to present fascism as a solution to Italy's problems, particularly in the wake of World War I, was one of the key factors in his rise to power. Mussolini's speeches were filled with grandiose promises of national renewal, unity, and strength, and he used his image as a charismatic leader to rally the Italian people behind his cause. His speeches were designed to create a sense of collective identity and to instill a sense of pride in Italy's future. Mussolini's intellectual legacy is, of course, deeply controversial. While some admire his writings for their clarity and vision, others condemn them for their authoritarianism and their role in justifying fascism. Mussolini's ideas on the state, authority, and nationalism have been used by various political groups throughout history, both to justify authoritarian rule and to challenge liberal democratic ideals. Fascism, as articulated by Mussolini, remains one of the most dangerous and oppressive ideologies of the 20th century, and his writings continue to serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and totalitarianism. In retrospect, Mussolini's political thought was a combination of nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism. He sought to replace liberal democracy with a strong, centralized state that would regulate all aspects of society. His vision of the state was one that subjugated the individual to the needs of the nation, and his emphasis on militarism and corporatism reflected his belief that Italy's strength lay in its ability to assert itself through force and unity. His writings continue to serve as a key source for understanding fascist ideology, and his legacy as a political thinker remains inextricably tied to the rise of fascism in Italy and beyond. Mussolini's foreign policy, like many aspects of his leadership, was driven by his vision of national greatness and Italy's place in the world. As a man who had risen to power with the promise of restoring Italy to its former glory, Mussolini's foreign policy was characterized by imperialism, expansionism, and an unyielding desire to make Italy a dominant power in the Mediterranean and beyond. His ambitions were shaped not only by the military conquests of past empires, but also by a deep sense of national pride and an urge to elevate Italy's status on the world stage. One of Mussolini's key goals was the creation of an Italian empire, akin to the Roman Empire, that would place Italy at the centre of the Mediterranean world. He saw Italy as the natural leader of the Mediterranean region, and believed that Italy's future lay in expanding its territorial influence, particularly in North Africa. Mussolini's ambitions were both a response to Italy's historical sense of weakness and a direct challenge to the colonial powers of Europe. His foreign policy would ultimately lead to both military success and failure, as he tried to match Italy's imperial ambitions with the realities of global politics. In his early years as leader of Italy, Mussolini focused on asserting Italian dominance in North Africa. Mussolini's aspirations were rooted in Italy's historical claims over territories in Africa, particularly in Libya, which Italy had colonized in 1911. His first significant action in pursuit of this goal was the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, a move that would have lasting consequences for both Italy and the broader international community. The invasion was largely motivated by Mussolini's desire to create a new Italian empire in Africa and to avenge the humiliating defeat Italy had suffered at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, when Ethiopian forces had successfully repelled Italian invaders. The invasion of Ethiopia, while militarily successful, drew international condemnation. The League of Nations imposed sanctions on Italy, but these were largely ineffective. Mussolini was able to present the conquest as a triumph of Italian nationalism and fascism. He declared the creation of the Italian East African Empire, which united Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia under Italian control. Despite the victory, the international backlash weakened Mussolini's standing and further alienated Italy from the Western powers. Mussolini's foreign policy, particularly in relation to Ethiopia, would become increasingly intertwined with his desire to secure Italy's place in a new, fascist-dominated Europe. As Mussolini sought to expand Italy's influence in Africa and the Mediterranean, his foreign policy began to take on a more aggressive tone. In the mid-1930s, Mussolini sought closer relations with Nazi Germany. Seeing Adolf Hitler as a valuable ally in his quest for an expanded Italian empire, Italy's relationship with Germany, solidified by the Pact of Steel in 1939, would provide Mussolini with the military and diplomatic support needed to pursue his ambitions. Mussolini, though initially skeptical of Nazi ideology, saw the alliance as a way to strengthen Italy's position in Europe and to gain access to resources that would enable Italy to challenge Britain and France for dominance in the Mediterranean. As Germany moved toward expanding its own territory in Europe, Mussolini's foreign policy became increasingly aligned with Hitler's goals. The two countries began to coordinate their actions in Europe and beyond, and Mussolini's Italy became a partner in the Nazi drive for territorial conquest. Mussolini saw the expansion of fascism in Europe as an opportunity for Italy to gain more power and influence, particularly in areas like the Balkans and the Mediterranean. Italy's military involvement in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, where Mussolini sent troops to support the fascist forces of Francisco Franco, was another way for Mussolini to assert his influence in the region. Mussolini's involvement in the Spanish Civil War further strengthened his alliance with Hitler and gave him an opportunity to support fascism beyond Italy's borders. However, Italy's involvement in the war also exposed the limits of Mussolini's military power. The Spanish Civil War was costly, and Italian forces were not always successful in their interventions. Mussolini's inability to decisively support Franco's forces in Spain demonstrated the weaknesses of the Italian military and highlighted the challenges Mussolini would face in his larger imperial ambitions. Mussolini's alignment with Germany led to Italy's involvement in World War II in 1940. At the time, Nazi Germany was already making significant gains in Europe, having invaded Poland and defeated France. Mussolini, eager to share in the spoils of war, declared Italy's entrance into the conflict on the side of the Axis powers. Mussolini hoped that Italy's participation in the war would allow it to expand its territorial holdings and assert itself as a dominant force in the Mediterranean. Italy's military campaigns, however, were disastrous. The Italian invasion of France in 1940 was poorly executed and failed to achieve its objectives. The Italian military's lack of preparedness, inadequate equipment, and poor coordination left Italy unable to effectively challenge the French or the British. Mussolini's attempt to expand Italy's influence in North Africa also faltered, as the British launched successful counterattacks, eventually pushing Italian forces out of Libya and into retreat. The situation worsened for Italy when the United States and the United Kingdom began to target Italian positions in North Africa, marking the beginning of Italy's military decline. Despite these setbacks, Mussolini remained committed to his vision of Italian expansion. He increasingly relied on Nazi Germany for military support and guidance, and Germany's success in the early years of the war bolstered Mussolini's confidence. However, as the war turned against the Axis powers, Mussolini's foreign policy became more aligned with Hitler's militaristic ambitions, leaving Italy increasingly dependent on German assistance. Mussolini's attempts to assert Italian dominance in the Mediterranean ultimately failed, and the consequences of Italy's involvement in the war would lead to the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime. In the final years of the war, Mussolini's foreign policy became a reflection of Italy's increasingly desperate position. His attempts to continue fighting in the war, even as the Allies advanced through Italy, showed the extent of his commitment to the fascist cause. Yet, as Italy's defeat became inevitable, Mussolini's role in the war became largely symbolic, as he was increasingly isolated from the political and military decision-making that shaped the course of the conflict. His alliance with Hitler ultimately led to Italy's downfall, and his aspirations for a powerful fascist Italy in the Mediterranean were left in ruins. The final years of Benito Mussolini's rule were marked by increasing political instability, military failure, and the unravelling of the fascist state he'd worked so hard to build. As Italy's fortunes in World War II deteriorated, Mussolini found himself increasingly isolated, both within Italy and in the international community, his earlier confidence, built on promises of national glory and strength, was shattered by the devastating impact of the war. By the time the Allies began to invade Italy in 1943, Mussolini's hold on power had become precarious and his downfall was inevitable. In 1943, as the war entered its most critical phase, Mussolini's military failures were mounting. The Italian military had suffered crushing defeats in North Africa, and Italy's economy was being strained to the breaking point by the demands of the war. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini's fascist regime. The Allies had successfully landed on Italian soil, and Italian cities were beginning to fall into enemy hands. The people of Italy, weary from years of war and suffering under fascist rule, began to turn against Mussolini and his government. Mussolini's leadership was increasingly questioned by members of his own government and military. By this point, even some of Mussolini's closest allies had begun to see him as a liability. The defeat in North Africa, the failures in the Mediterranean, and the growing strength of the Allied forces left Mussolini with little support. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, who had once backed Mussolini's rise to power, now saw the fascist leader as a threat to the country's survival. In July 1943, Mussolini's own Grand Council of Fascism, the ruling body of the fascist state, began to turn against him. The council, which had once been a loyal instrument of Mussolini's power, now saw the writing on the wall. The political and military establishment, once aligned with Mussolini, had become deeply disillusioned with his leadership. The Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power, and the king, emboldened by the growing opposition, agreed to have him arrested. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini was ousted from office and arrested by the order of King Victor Emmanuel III. The coup was swift and decisive. Mussolini, once the unchallenged leader of Italy, was now a prisoner of the state. His arrest marked the official end of the fascist regime. The king appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio, a former military leader who'd been loyal to Mussolini, as the new prime minister. Badoglio immediately set about negotiating an armistice with the Allies, effectively surrendering Italy to the Allied forces. Mussolini's arrest and removal from power were not the final blows to his political career, however. While he was imprisoned in Gran Sasso, a mountain resort in central Italy, Mussolini remained a figure of significant political interest. His fascist ideology still had supporters, and many within the military and political elite of northern Italy remained loyal to his cause. Mussolini's fate was not sealed until the German military intervened. In September 1943, Adolf Hitler ordered a daring mission to rescue Mussolini from his imprisonment. The German commandos, led by Otto Skorzeny, launched a raid on the mountain retreat where Mussolini was held, and they successfully freed him. Mussolini, once again in the hands of the Germans, was taken to northern Italy, where the German authorities set him up as the head of a new puppet regime, the Italian Social Republic, RSI. This new state, based in the northern part of Italy, was a weak and fragmented entity, controlled by the Germans and lacking popular support. Mussolini was no longer the dictator he once was. His authority had been severely diminished. He was now little more than a figurehead, a leader of a broken and divided state. The Italian Social Republic under Mussolini's leadership was marked by further chaos, as Mussolini had little control over the actual governance of the region. The German military held the real power, and Mussolini's role was largely symbolic. The RSI's main function was to act as a puppet state for Nazi Germany, assisting in the fight against the advancing Allied forces, while also maintaining fascist ideology in Italy's northern regions. Mussolini was now a man trapped between the demands of the Nazis and the increasing disillusionment of the Italian people, who were suffering under the harsh conditions of war and occupation. As the Allies advanced through Italy, liberating cities in the south and moving northward, Mussolini's situation grew increasingly precarious. His power had been reduced to little more than a facade, and even his loyal followers could not sustain the RSI for much longer. Mussolini's death was becoming inevitable, and as the war came to a close, his reign as leader of Italy had all but ended. In April 1945, as the Allies closed in on northern Italy, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Petacci, in an effort to escape the advancing Allied forces. But his escape was short-lived. Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans near the town of Dongo, just days before the end of the war in Europe. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were executed by the partisans, marking the final chapter in his tumultuous reign. Mussolini's body, along with that of Clara Petacci, was displayed publicly in Milan, where it was subjected to further humiliation. The brutal manner of his death and the public display of his body symbolized the complete collapse of fascism in Italy. Mussolini, who had once been revered as the douche and the saviour of Italy, was now nothing more than a symbol of the failures and horrors of fascism. The immediate aftermath of Mussolini's death was chaotic. Italy was still reeling from the devastation of the war, and the fascist regime had left behind a country in ruins. The Italian people, having endured years of war, occupation and fascist rule, were eager to rebuild their nation, but the scars of Mussolini's time in power would take years to heal. The Italian Republic was officially born in 1946, following the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a democratic government, marking a fresh start for Italy after the long shadow of fascism. The legacy of Benito Mussolini and his fascist regime has remained a deeply divisive issue, both within Italy and internationally. Fascism, as conceived by Mussolini, was a political and ideological system that emphasized authoritarian rule, nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of the state over the individual. In retrospect, Mussolini's fascism can be understood as a response to the political and social turmoil of the early 20th century, particularly the aftermath of World War I, the rise of communism, and the failure of liberal democratic systems to address the needs of the people. At its core, Mussolini's fascism sought to restore national pride and power in Italy, which had been left weakened and humiliated after the Great War. Mussolini and his followers viewed Italy as a nation in decline, politically fragmented, economically unstable, and politically ineffective. For Mussolini, the answer to Italy's woes was a strong centralized government led by a powerful leader, with total control over the state's military, economy, and social structures. The fascist state, as envisioned by Mussolini, would transcend the divisions of class, politics, and ideology, and unite Italy into a single, cohesive entity under the control of the Duce. Mussolini's philosophy of fascism was grounded in the belief that democracy, liberalism, and socialism were weak and inefficient. He believed that Italy needed a strong leader and a centralized government that could act decisively and implement bold policies. Under Mussolini, the fascist state aimed to unite the country's diverse interests by integrating various sectors of society into a corporatist structure, where workers, employers, and the state would all collaborate to achieve national unity and prosperity. However, in practice, corporatism served as a tool for the fascist state to suppress labor movements, regulate the economy, and maintain control over all aspects of Italian society. In his speeches and writings, Mussolini repeatedly stressed the importance of militarism, nationalism, and imperialism as key components of his ideology. He believed that a strong, expanding Italy was essential for restoring national pride and ensuring Italy's place as a great power in Europe. Mussolini's imperial ambitions were realized through his efforts to expand Italy's territory in Africa, most notably through the conquest of Ethiopia in 1935. Mussolini viewed the Ethiopian campaign as a means to avenge Italy's previous defeat in the Battle of Adwa, 1896, and to create an empire that would rival the great colonial powers of Europe. The military campaign in Ethiopia, though presented as a triumph, was also a source of international condemnation and led to Italy's increasing isolation from the Western powers. Mussolini's decision to pursue further military expansion through World War II in alliance with Nazi Germany would ultimately result in Italy's catastrophic involvement in the war and the collapse of the fascist regime. By the time Mussolini was arrested and executed in 1945, the fascist vision of a powerful, unified Italy had been destroyed, and the country was left in ruins. Despite the failure of Mussolini's fascist regime, it is important to acknowledge the appeal of his ideas during the early years of his rule. For many Italians in the 1920s and 1930s, Mussolini's promise of order, stability, and national greatness resonated deeply. After the chaos of World War I and the political fragmentation that followed, many saw Mussolini as a strong leader who could restore Italy's pride and bring the country back to its rightful place in the world. Mussolini's early years in power were marked by significant infrastructure improvements, such as the construction of highways, bridges, and public works projects. Mussolini's government also made efforts to address issues such as poverty and unemployment, although these efforts were often limited and were overshadowed by his increasing authoritarianism. Mussolini's regime also introduced significant social changes, particularly in the areas of education, youth organizations, and the role of women in Italian society. The fascist regime sought to create a unified national identity that transcended regional divisions and emphasized loyalty to the state. Mussolini's propaganda machine, which promoted the cult of the leader and the ideals of fascism, played a crucial role in fostering a sense of national unity and pride. Mussolini himself became a larger-than-life figure, portrayed as the savior of Italy and the embodiment of its strength and unity. However, Mussolini's authoritarianism was ultimately what defined his rule and led to the downfall of fascism in Italy. His suppression of political opposition, control of the media, and use of violence to maintain power left little room for dissent. Political opponents, particularly socialists, communists, and liberals, were silenced through intimidation, imprisonment, and even assassination. Mussolini's black shirts, the paramilitary force that played a key role in his rise to power, were used to violently suppress strikes, protests, and any challenges to the fascist state. The OVRA, Mussolini's secret police, kept a tight grip on the population through surveillance and repression. In terms of foreign policy, Mussolini's alliance with Nazi Germany was a critical aspect of his downfall. Though initially hesitant to embrace Hitler's extreme ideology, Mussolini eventually aligned Italy with Nazi Germany through the Pact of Steel in 1939. Mussolini's decision to enter World War II on the side of the Axis powers, despite Italy's lack of preparation, led to military disaster and the eventual defeat of the fascist state. The economic and human cost of the war left Italy devastated, and Mussolini's failure to secure Italy's imperial ambitions became a tragic symbol of his regime's failure. The legacy of Mussolini's fascism continues to be debated. For some, his early years in power represent a period of national pride and unity, while for others, his authoritarian rule, military aggression, and ultimate failure in World War II overshadow any achievements. The fascist period is remembered for its emphasis on strong leadership, nationalism, and militarism, but also for its brutal suppression of dissent and the eventual collapse of the Italian state. In the years following Mussolini's death, fascism was officially disbanded in Italy, but elements of his ideology continued to influence political movements on the far right. Neo-fascist groups, both in Italy and elsewhere, have attempted to revive Mussolini's vision, though they have faced significant opposition from both the public and the political establishment. Mussolini's legacy serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and the extreme nationalism that defined his rule. As such, His life and ideology continue to provoke strong emotions and debates about the nature of fascism and its place in modern history. Mussolini's fascist regime left an indelible mark on Italian society, shaping the political, social, and cultural landscape of Italy for decades to come. While fascism ultimately crumbled with Mussolini's death in 1945, the ideologies and methods of the regime continued to influence Italy in profound ways long after the fall of Mussolini's leadership. His vision for the Italian state and its people, though largely dismantled after his death, still echoed in the fabric of post-war Italy, affecting everything from the country's political landscape to its identity and public memory. One of the most important legacies of Mussolini's fascism was its impact on the Italian state. Mussolini envisioned a totalitarian state where the government had control over all aspects of public and private life, from the economy to the media to education. While many of the formal structures of fascism were dismantled after his regime fell, the legacy of centralized control and authoritarian rule continued to shape Italy's political development. The fascist emphasis on strong, charismatic leadership set the stage for future political movements that would advocate for authoritarian or nationalist policies, even as Italy moved towards a more democratic form of government after World War II. In the post-war period, Italy experienced a period of political and social transformation. The Italian Republic, established in 1946 after the abolition of the monarchy, was a sharp break from Mussolini's fascist state. However, the fascist period had created deep rifts within Italian society. The division between those who had supported Mussolini's regime and those who had fought against it during the resistance led to a bitter political climate in the immediate post-war years. For many, Mussolini's fascism had been a betrayal of Italian values, while for others, it represented a period of national strength and unity, albeit through authoritarian means. Fascist-era institutions like the Oviara, the regime's secret police, and corporate structures designed to regulate the economy and labor relations were formally dismantled, but they left behind a culture of control and centralization that would influence Italy's political culture. In particular, the corporatist system that Mussolini created to resolve class conflict by integrating workers and employers into state-controlled organizations became a foundational idea for certain sectors of Italian society that supported strong governmental control of the economy. This legacy would persist in Italian politics, especially in the years following World War II, as the country's economy underwent modernization. Mussolini's fascist state also had a profound effect on the Italian family structure, particularly in its emphasis on the role of women and the youth. Mussolini's fascism idealized the family as the cornerstone of the nation. Women were encouraged to stay at home and focus on raising children, especially as the fascist regime pushed for a population boom to increase Italy's military potential. Mussolini promoted the idea of a strong male-dominated household, where the roles of women were confined to the domestic sphere. The regime's policies provided incentives for large families, and motherhood was glorified as a patriotic duty. The fascist government even provided financial incentives for women to have more children and supported the establishment of maternity hospitals and birth control policies aimed at boosting the Italian birth rate. Fascism also had a lasting impact on Italian youth. Mussolini believed that the youth were the future of fascism and the nation, and his regime dedicated considerable efforts to shaping the next generation of Italians into loyal, disciplined citizens of the fascist state. Young people were encouraged to join fascist youth organizations such as the Balilla and the Avanguardisti, which were modeled on Nazi Germany's Hitler Youth. These organizations aimed to instill in young Italians a sense of nationalism, militarism, and obedience to the state. The regime also promoted the idea of physical fitness and discipline, reflecting Mussolini's obsession with creating a physically strong and resilient nation. The regime's extensive use of propaganda and state-controlled media played a significant role in shaping Italian society. Mussolini and his regime were keenly aware of the power of public opinion and used the media to create a cult of personality around the leader. Mussolini's image appeared everywhere, on posters, in films, and on the radio. The media was tightly controlled by the state, and Mussolini used it to project an image of a dynamic, capable leader who was single-handedly rebuilding Italy after its defeat in World War I. His speeches were broadcast to the masses, and the Italian public was bombarded with images of Mussolini's strength and determination. Through these methods, the regime sought to create a sense of unity and purpose among the people, while suppressing dissent and encouraging loyalty to the fascist cause. Mussolini's policies also had a profound effect on the Italian economy. Early in his rule, Mussolini focused on rebuilding Italy's economy, which had been ravaged by the aftermath of World War I and the economic instability of the interwar years. Mussolini's corporatist system, though never fully realized in practice, sought to replace capitalism and socialism with a state-controlled economy in which the government mediated between workers and employers. Mussolini's economic policies also focused on public works programs designed to provide employment, such as the construction of roads, railways and bridges, all of which contributed to Italy's economic modernization. Despite these efforts, Italy's economy remained largely agrarian, and industrial development was uneven, with many regions of the country remaining underdeveloped. The economic and social policies of the fascist regime laid the groundwork for some of the challenges Italy would face in the post-war years. Mussolini's emphasis on self-sufficiency and his focus on expanding the military-industrial complex left Italy with an economy that was increasingly militarized. After the war, Italy would have to rebuild not only its physical infrastructure but also its economy, which had been ravaged by fascist policies and the devastation of the war. After Mussolini's execution and the fall of fascism, Italy's new democratic government faced the difficult task of reconciling with the fascist past. Dealing with the legacy of fascism, from its public monuments and symbols to its ideological and political followers, became a central challenge for post-war Italy. Many Italians felt the need to move beyond the fascist era, but the country was still grappling with the reality that Mussolini's regime had been a significant part of their recent history. The legacy of fascism continued to cast a shadow over Italy's political culture, and the far-right political groups that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s sought to revive Mussolini's ideals. Though these groups never gained significant political power, their presence demonstrated that Mussolini's legacy had not been entirely erased. In Italy's national memory, Mussolini's fascism remains a divisive and controversial topic. For some, it represents a tragic chapter in Italy's history, characterized by dictatorship, repression and war. For others, Mussolini's early years in power are remembered as a time of national pride and stability, when Italy seemed to be on the rise as a major European power. The ongoing debate about Mussolini's legacy continues to be a central issue in Italian politics and culture, especially as the far right periodically resurges in the country. Benito Mussolini's influence on Italy and the world extends far beyond his time in power, and his legacy continues to be shaped by how he is remembered in popular culture and historical memory. The portrayal of Mussolini, both during his rule and after his death, has varied greatly, from glorification and admiration by his supporters to condemnation and vilification by his critics. In modern Italy and globally, Mussolini's legacy continues to provoke debate, reflection, and at times, controversy. During Mussolini's time as Italy's fascist leader, propaganda played a central role in shaping his public image. Mussolini cultivated an almost mythical persona, casting himself as the savior of Italy and the embodiment of the nation's power and resilience. His image was ubiquitous, appearing on posters, in films, and through speeches that presented him as a dynamic and infallible leader. This cult of personality was reinforced by the fascist-controlled media, which painted Mussolini as a heroic figure who had restored order to a broken Italy after the chaos of World War I. Propaganda was not just a tool for Mussolini's regime to solidify its control over Italy, it was also used to generate a sense of pride and unity, portraying the fascist state as the ultimate force of national revival. However, with the fall of Mussolini and the end of fascism in Italy, the narrative surrounding him began to change. After his execution in 1945, Mussolini's image became a point of contention, especially in the post-war years when Italy was rebuilding itself and seeking to move past its fascist past. His public execution, in which his body was displayed in Milan for public humiliation, served as a stark and violent repudiation of his rule. The symbolic image of Mussolini's body hung upside down became a defining image of Italy's rejection of fascism. For many Italians, Mussolini's death marked the end of fascism as an ideology, but his memory remained complicated and deeply divisive. In the years following World War II, Mussolini's image as a dictator was firmly established in public memory as one associated with oppression, war, and authoritarianism. Yet, while Mussolini's political ideas were largely rejected by the new Italian Republic, his legacy continued to linger in popular culture and Italian politics. For some, especially those on the far right, Mussolini remained a symbol of national pride, authority, and strength. Neo-fascist groups in Italy, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, sought to revive Mussolini's vision and bring fascism back into the political conversation, albeit in a modified form. These groups often invoked Mussolini's image as a reminder of the greatness of fascist Italy, portraying him as a misunderstood figure who had been unjustly demonized. On the other hand, Mussolini's image as a fascist dictator who led Italy into the disaster of World War II has been firmly established in mainstream culture and historical scholarship as a symbol of the dangers of totalitarianism and militarism. Many post-war films, books, and documentaries about Mussolini and fascism have emphasized the brutal realities of his regime, its violent suppression of political dissent, its warmongering foreign policy, and its collaboration with Nazi Germany. The idea of fascism as a radical, repressive ideology is often encapsulated in depictions of Mussolini's reign, which focus on the tragic consequences of his imperial ambitions and totalitarian rule. In the cinema, Mussolini has been portrayed in various ways, ranging from the sympathetic to the critical. In films like The Lion of the Desert, 1981, and Mussolini: The Untold Story, 1985, Mussolini is depicted as a charismatic and ambitious leader, driven by a desire to restore Italy's glory, but ultimately undone by his own errors. In these portrayals, Mussolini's character is often shown as a tragic figure whose authoritarian methods and alliances with Hitler led Italy into ruin. These films often focus on the human complexity of Mussolini, presenting him not just as a dictator, but as a man grappling with the challenges of leadership in a volatile time. In contrast, other films and documentaries emphasize the brutality of Mussolini's regime. Documentaries about World War II, such as The World at War, 1973, often include Mussolini as part of a broader narrative on the Axis powers, focusing on his role in the war and his collaboration with Hitler. These portrayals typically emphasize Mussolini's role in instigating war, his fascist policies, and the suffering caused by his militaristic ambitions. The posthumous image of Mussolini in such works is one of a misguided authoritarian leader whose policies led to disaster, both for Italy and for the world. The representation of Mussolini in popular culture is also informed by the broader historical debate on fascism. In Italy, debates about fascism and Mussolini's role in it continue to this day, with some arguing that Mussolini's policies had positive aspects, such as his early efforts to modernize the economy and reduce unemployment, while others focus on the devastation caused by his militarism and alliance with Hitler. Scholars of fascism have emphasized the importance of Mussolini's legacy in understanding the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, particularly in terms of the relationship between fascism, militarism, and nationalism. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in Mussolini and his regime, as neo-fascist movements in Italy and beyond attempt to reclaim and reinterpret his legacy. This has led to renewed discussions in Italy about how to address Mussolini's historical role, particularly in terms of public memory. Some Italian cities, for example, have been debating whether to remove statues and street names that honour Mussolini, while others defend their preservation, citing their historical significance. The tension between these two perspectives reflects the ongoing struggle within Italy to come to terms with its fascist past and define its identity in the post-fascist era. Mussolini's legacy also plays a role in global discussions of fascism and authoritarianism, as the world faces a rise in populist and nationalist movements. Mussolini's regime serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of totalitarian leadership and the erosion of democratic values. His fascist ideology, which promised strength and unity but ultimately led to war, destruction and national disgrace, continues to resonate as a reminder of the perils of unchecked power and the authoritarian impulse. After Benito Mussolini's execution in April 1945 and the collapse of the Italian Social Republic, RSI, Italy faced the challenging task of rebuilding itself as a republic and addressing the legacy of fascism. Mussolini's rule had left Italy deeply divided, both politically and socially, and the scars of his authoritarian regime were visible in every aspect of Italian life. The end of Mussolini's rule did not immediately erase the impact of fascism on Italy, and the country's post-war recovery would require significant efforts to distance itself from its fascist past, while also dealing with the political and ideological divisions that Mussolini's regime had exacerbated. Italy's post-fascist transition began with the establishment of the Italian Republic in 1946, following a referendum that abolished the monarchy and set the country on a new path as a democratic nation. The transition was not easy, as many Italians had been deeply involved in Mussolini's fascist regime, either as supporters or as active participants in the government, military or fascist organizations. For others, particularly those who had fought in the resistance against fascism, Mussolini's fall was a moment of reckoning. But the task of rebuilding Italy as a republic was a complicated and contentious process. One of the most significant steps in the post-war period was the defascisation of Italian society. The new government was focused on removing fascist elements from political life, dismantling fascist organizations, and purging the bureaucracy and military of individuals who had been loyal to Mussolini's regime. The Italian Social Republic, the fascist puppet state Mussolini had established under Nazi German control, had been fully dismantled by 1945, but its influence remained in the form of those who'd been complicit in fascist policies. The Italian constitution, adopted in 1948, was a key moment in Italy's rejection of fascism. It established a democratic system of government that emphasized individual rights, political pluralism, and separation of powers. The constitution also included provisions that specifically prohibited the resurgence of fascism, banning organizations that promoted fascist ideology, and giving the government the power to dissolve any political party or group associated with fascism. This was an effort to ensure that the mistakes of Mussolini's regime would not be repeated. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Italy also faced the challenge of reparations and accountability for the crimes committed during the fascist era. Mussolini's regime had been responsible for numerous atrocities, including the use of chemical weapons in Ethiopia, the persecution of political opponents, and the collaboration with Nazi Germany in the Holocaust. Mussolini's support for Hitler led to Italy's involvement in the deportation of Jews, and many Italians were complicit in the crimes of fascism, either by supporting the regime or by being active participants in its repression. After the war, Italy was forced to confront the legacy of fascism and the role it had played in the broader horrors of the war. One of the lasting effects of Mussolini's rule was the division within Italian society. The fascist legacy left a deep scar in the collective consciousness of the nation. On one hand, there were those who viewed Mussolini as a tragic figure who had been led astray, and who felt nostalgia for his early years in power when he had promised stability and national pride. On the other hand, there were those who saw Mussolini's regime as an unmitigated disaster, one that had plunged Italy into war, sacrificed countless lives and left the country in ruins. This ideological divide played a significant role in post-war Italian politics, as factions on both the left and right sought to shape Italy's future. After Mussolini's death, the Italian Communist Party, along with other leftist organizations, sought to build a new Italy that was rooted in democratic socialism and anti-fascist ideals. These groups, which had led the resistance against Mussolini's regime, aimed to create a society that was politically and socially inclusive, rejecting the totalitarianism and militarism that had defined Mussolini's rule. The Communist Party played a significant role in the creation of the new Italian Republic, even though it never gained full control of the government. However, tensions between the left and right would persist throughout the post-war years, with the Communist Party and other left-wing groups at odds with the conservative Christian Democrat establishment. On the other hand, Mussolini's followers and sympathizers sought to maintain his vision of fascism and its principles. Neo-fascist groups, many of them concentrated in the northern and central regions of Italy, continued to espouse Mussolini's ideologies, including authoritarianism, nationalism, and anti-communism. These groups sought to preserve Mussolini's memory as a symbol of Italian greatness, and some even attempted to revive fascist parties in the post-war years. Despite their efforts, however, the rise of neo-fascism was largely marginalized, as Italy's new democratic system made it difficult for fascism to regain significant political traction. Yet fascist nostalgia never entirely disappeared, and Mussolini's supporters continued to see his leadership as a source of pride, especially in times of political instability. The task of reconciling with Mussolini's fascist past also meant confronting the memory of World War II and Italy's role in the conflict. Mussolini's regime had played a central role in the war, aligning Italy with Nazi Germany and engaging in military aggression that led to devastating consequences for the country and the world. Italy's participation in the war was not without internal divisions, and many Italians, particularly those in the resistance, fought against fascism and Mussolini's government. The process of coming to terms with this history involved a re-examination of Italy's role in the war, and the eventual victory of the Allied forces led to Italy's occupation and the end of fascism. As Italy rebuilt itself in the post-war years, the tension between remembering Mussolini's fascist regime and the desire to move forward as a democratic republic persisted. His legacy remained divisive, and the question of how to honor or condemn Mussolini was debated for many years. Even in the 21st century, Mussolini's memory continues to stir controversy, as his role in shaping Italy's history and the country's complicated relationship with fascism are still subjects of discussion and reflection. One of the most enduring legacies of Benito Mussolini's regime was the rise of Italian nationalism and its deep entanglement with fascist ideology. Mussolini's vision of a powerful and unified Italy resonated deeply with a population recovering from the disillusionment of the post-World War I era. His focus on national pride, strength, and unity provided a vision that many Italians could rally behind in the face of social and economic challenges. However, the form of nationalism Mussolini promoted was deeply intertwined with the authoritarian, militaristic, and imperialistic goals of fascism. Mussolini's nationalistic vision was rooted in his belief that Italy had the potential to return to the glory of the Roman Empire. From the outset of his political career, Mussolini sought to revive Italy's greatness, a concept that for him could only be achieved through the establishment of a totalitarian state that would bring about national unity and strength. He aimed to unify the country by promoting a sense of shared purpose among Italians, transcending regional and class divisions that had traditionally fragmented the nation. The Italian nationalism that Mussolini promoted was also marked by his militarism. Mussolini viewed the military as the primary instrument for achieving national greatness. He believed that a powerful military was essential for expanding Italy's influence, particularly in the Mediterranean and North Africa, and for maintaining the internal strength of the fascist state. Mussolini's emphasis on military power and conquest was not just about territorial expansion. It was also a way of binding the Italian people together through the shared experience of strength, discipline, and sacrifice. Mussolini's militaristic nationalism was evident in the regime's policies. The fascist state created organizations like the Balilla, the fascist youth movement, to instill values of patriotism and duty from a young age. These organizations promoted physical fitness, national pride, and loyalty to the fascist state. The regime used these groups to cultivate a new generation of Italians who would be dedicated to the cause of fascism and to Italy's role as a military and imperial power. This emphasis on the militarization of society was central to Mussolini's vision of a fascist Italy that would rise to power on the world stage. In addition to his military focus, Mussolini's nationalism was also tied to his desire for imperial expansion. Mussolini believed that Italy's true greatness could only be achieved by emulating the imperial models of nations like Britain and France. For Mussolini, empire building was a way to restore Italy's ancient Roman glory. His imperial ambitions focused primarily on North Africa, where Mussolini sought to expand Italy's colonial holdings by invading Ethiopia in 1935. The invasion of Ethiopia was framed as a means of reasserting Italy's power and rectifying the humiliation of Italy's defeat in the Battle of Adwa in 1896. While the conquest of Ethiopia was presented as a triumph of Italian nationalism, it also highlighted the inherent contradictions in Mussolini's vision of national unity. Mussolini's imperial ambitions in Africa were not just about national pride, they were also about projecting power on the international stage. His actions alienated Italy from much of the international community, particularly the League of Nations, which imposed sanctions on Italy in response to the invasion. The invasion also exposed the weaknesses of the Italian military, which struggled to contend with Ethiopian resistance despite its technological superiority. Mussolini's imperialism and nationalism were also tied to his vision of corporatism. Fascist corporatism aimed to integrate different sectors of society, workers, employers, and the state, into a unified structure that would serve the interests of the nation. Mussolini promoted corporatism as a way of transcending class conflict, but in practice, it served to reinforce the power of the state and to maintain the dominance of fascist ideals. The corporatist system was part of Mussolini's broader strategy to create a unified, harmonious society that would align itself with the goals of the fascist state. Mussolini's form of Italian nationalism was also connected to his anti-communism. As the leader of fascism, Mussolini positioned himself as the direct opposition to the spread of socialism and communism, which he viewed as threats to national unity and strength. Fascism, in his view, was the antidote to the divisive forces of class struggle and revolution. Mussolini's nationalism was in direct contrast to the ideals of the left, and the fascist state sought to suppress any form of socialist or communist movement through both legal and violent means. Under Mussolini, nationalism also became synonymous with loyalty to the fascist regime. The state sought to control and define the identity of the Italian people, using propaganda and public spectacle to create a unified sense of Italian pride that was bound to the fascist cause. Mussolini's speeches and his constant image in the media helped shape the national consciousness, making his leadership synonymous with the strength and future of Italy. The use of state-controlled media, along with the creation of a fascist culture, played a significant role in promoting nationalism as an unquestioned value in Mussolini's Italy. However, Mussolini's nationalism was not entirely successful in achieving unity. While the regime did manage to rally a significant portion of the Italian population behind its fascist ideals, there was also significant resistance to the regime. The partisan movement, which grew during and after World War II, was a powerful example of the opposition to Mussolini's authoritarian rule. Many Italians, particularly those in the working class, rejected the fascist vision of Italy as a militarized imperialist state. Resistance groups fought against Mussolini's fascists both during the war and in the years leading up to the regime's fall. These groups ultimately contributed to Mussolini's downfall and the collapse of the fascist state in Italy. Despite the collapse of Mussolini's regime, Italian nationalism continued to play an important role in the political life of post-war Italy. In the years following Mussolini's execution, there was an ongoing debate about the role of nationalism in the formation of the Italian Republic. While fascism was officially repudiated, the question of how to define Italian identity remained central to the nation's political culture. The legacy of Mussolini's nationalism continues to shape Italy's modern political movements, including those on the far right, which sometimes draw on Mussolini's rhetoric to promote a more aggressive, nationalist vision of Italy's role in Europe. Mussolini's nationalist vision, though now deeply discredited in Italy, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme nationalism when combined with authoritarian rule and imperial ambition. Mussolini's fascist nationalism led Italy into a devastating war, leaving the country in ruins and cementing his legacy as one of history's most controversial leaders. His nationalism, based on the myth of Italy's greatness, ultimately led to disaster rather than glory, and it remains a powerful reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked authoritarianism. Benito Mussolini's fascism was not an isolated phenomenon, but a part of a broader wave of authoritarian movements that emerged in the early 20th century. Mussolini himself often looked beyond Italy's borders for inspiration, drawing on the political changes taking place in Europe and across the world. His vision for Italy was shaped not only by his belief in nationalism and authoritarianism, but also by his desire to align Italy with other fascist and totalitarian regimes. Mussolini's fascist ideology did not exist in a vacuum. It was deeply influenced by the global political environment and had a profound impact on the course of world history. Mussolini was keenly aware of the rise of authoritarian movements across Europe, most notably in Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. The similarities between Mussolini's fascism and Hitler's Nazism are often highlighted, though Mussolini's fascism was initially more focused on nationalism and militarism than on racial ideology. However, as Mussolini's alliance with Hitler solidified in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Mussolini began to adopt more of the Nazi regime's methods and rhetoric. The Pact of Steel, 1939, which formally aligned Italy with Nazi Germany, marked the peak of this relationship, cementing Mussolini's place in the Axis powers during World War II. Mussolini's fascism shared many of the same core elements as Hitler's regime, including the totalitarian control of the state, the suppression of political opposition, and the glorification of military strength. However, Mussolini's fascism was initially more focused on the concept of the nation-state, seeking to forge a powerful and unified Italy that could rival other European powers, rather than pursuing the racialist ideology that defined Nazi Germany. Despite these differences, Mussolini and Hitler's shared goals of territorial expansion, military conquest, and the destruction of liberal democracy meant that their regimes were aligned in their broader aims. One of Mussolini's key objectives was to make Italy a central power in Europe and the Mediterranean. He viewed Italy's power as a counterbalance to the influence of Britain and France, which had long dominated the European political and colonial landscape. Mussolini sought to elevate Italy's status on the world stage, not just as a military and political power, but also as a cultural and ideological leader in the fight against liberalism, socialism, and communism. Mussolini's fascism was also influenced by the Italian Renaissance, which he sought to revive in the form of a new, modern Italian empire. Mussolini believed that Italy had lost its former glory and that fascism could restore the greatness of Italy's past. He imagined Italy as the inheritor of the Roman Empire, with its military conquests, cultural achievements, and imperial ambitions. Mussolini's focus on Italy's imperial expansion, particularly in Africa, was rooted in his belief that Italy could once again dominate the Mediterranean world, just as ancient Rome had done. This vision of imperial greatness led to Italy's conquest of Ethiopia in 1935, a bold attempt to create a new Italian empire in Africa. Beyond Europe, Mussolini's fascism was part of a global wave of authoritarianism that was sweeping across the world in the early 20th century. The end of World War I and the political chaos that followed created an environment in which fascism, along with other forms of authoritarian rule, could take root. Mussolini's rise to power was in many ways a response to the perceived failures of liberal democracy and the threats posed by socialism and communism. In this sense, Mussolini's fascism was part of a broader reactionary movement that sought to defend traditional values and national identity in the face of the radical changes brought about by the war and the Russian Revolution of 1917. Fascist movements spread across Europe during the interwar period, with leaders like Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal, and Pilsudski in Poland adopting elements of Mussolini's ideology in their respective countries. Mussolini's corporatism, his emphasis on state control over the economy and labour relations, and his use of paramilitary organisations to suppress opposition influenced many of these leaders. Mussolini's fascism also resonated with groups in Eastern Europe, where political instability and the rise of communism created fertile ground for authoritarian ideologies to flourish. Mussolini's vision was not limited to Europe. He also sought to align Italy with other authoritarian powers outside of Europe. Japan was another key partner in the Axis powers, and Mussolini admired Japan's ability to create a powerful military state while maintaining a sense of national identity and cultural unity. Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia, particularly in China and Manchuria, paralleled Mussolini's own goals in Africa. Italy, Germany, and Japan's alliance during World War II was based on mutual interests in expanding their territories and confronting the Western powers. However, Mussolini's relationship with Hitler and the Nazi regime grew increasingly problematic as World War II unfolded. Mussolini's military failures and Italy's struggles in the war left him dependent on Hitler's support. Yet Mussolini's power had become more symbolic, as Italy was increasingly drawn into Germany's military plans. Mussolini's foreign policy became increasingly shaped by Nazi Germany, and Mussolini's inability to assert Italy's interests in the war further undermined his credibility as a leader. This loss of independence and Mussolini's reliance on Hitler ultimately led to the downfall of his regime. Mussolini's fascism also had a global influence beyond Europe. His ideology and methods were studied and to some extent emulated by authoritarian regimes in Latin America and beyond. The fascist emphasis on nationalism, militarism, and state control of society resonated with leaders in countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, who were dealing with their own political and economic challenges. Fascist ideas were also absorbed by some political movements in the United States and other parts of the world, though the full implementation of Mussolini's ideology never took hold outside of Europe. Mussolini's foreign policy ultimately led to Italy's involvement in World War II, aligning the country with Nazi Germany and Japan. His imperial ambitions, rooted in his belief in a new Roman Empire, contributed to Italy's disastrous military campaigns, including the invasions of France and North Africa, and the failed attempts to assert Italy's dominance in the Mediterranean. Mussolini's foreign policy decisions, particularly his alliance with Hitler, led to Italy's eventual defeat and the collapse of the fascist state. In the aftermath of Mussolini's death, his fascism became a cautionary tale for the world. While fascist regimes were eventually defeated in World War II, Mussolini's rise and fall continued to be a subject of study and reflection. His fascist state was a reminder of the dangers of unchecked nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism. Mussolini's influence on global politics, especially in the context of the Axis powers and the larger authoritarian movements of the 20th century, remains a significant chapter in the history of fascism. The fall of Benito Mussolini and the collapse of his fascist regime left Italy with deep scars. While the fascist state was dismantled after Mussolini's death in 1945, its legacy continued to shape Italian politics, identity and culture for many years. Mussolini's vision of a totalitarian state rooted in nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism left behind a complex and contested inheritance that would be reflected in Italy's political development for decades after World War II. Mussolini's authoritarian rule and the rise of fascism in Italy had fundamentally altered the country's political landscape. The post-war period required Italy to come to terms with its fascist past, and the question of how to reconcile with Mussolini's legacy became one of the most difficult challenges for the newly formed Italian Republic. The collapse of fascism left Italy divided, with many of Mussolini's supporters continuing to promote his ideals, while others sought to ensure that the fascist era would never be repeated. The creation of the Italian Republic in 1946 was a crucial step in Italy's transition away from fascism. The country rejected its monarchical past and moved towards a new democratic system, anchored in the values of liberal democracy, pluralism, and human rights. The Italian constitution, adopted in 1948, enshrined democratic principles, establishing a system of government based on free elections, political freedoms, and the separation of powers. The fascist ideology, with its emphasis on authoritarianism, militarism, and imperialism, was formally repudiated by the Italian Republic. However, the transition from fascism to democracy was not without its difficulties. The process of defascisation was far from complete, and remnants of fascism remained in various forms. While Mussolini's fascist party was dissolved, many former fascists and supporters of Mussolini's regime remained in Italian society and political life. Some had held high positions in the fascist government, the military and the police, and their continued influence in the post-war period added to the political complexities Italy faced. The process of removing fascists from positions of power was gradual, and many former fascists were able to reintegrate into Italian society under the new republican system. The rise of neo-fascist movements in the post-war period was one of the most visible signs of Mussolini's ongoing influence. While fascism as a political ideology was officially disbanded, various neo-fascist groups continued to exist in Italy, seeking to revive Mussolini's vision of an authoritarian nationalist state. These groups were often marginalized but had a certain degree of influence in certain regions of Italy, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. Some neo-fascist groups, such as the Italian Social Movement (MSI), became politically active and tried to reclaim Mussolini's legacy, advocating for a return to some of the principles of fascism, including nationalism, military strength, and opposition to communism. These neo-fascist movements, however, faced significant opposition from both the left-wing political factions and from the broader Italian society, which had been shaped by the experiences of World War II and the fascist oppression under Mussolini's rule. The legacy of Mussolini was deeply divisive, with many Italians associating him with the destruction and suffering caused by his alliance with Nazi Germany, the war, and the horrors of the Holocaust. The Italian resistance, a group of partisan fighters who had opposed Mussolini's regime, continued to hold significant influence in post-war Italy, and their anti-fascist ideals shaped the new democratic government. Despite these divisions, Mussolini's legacy continued to resonate in Italian politics. In the 1970s and 1980s, as political instability gripped the country, Mussolini's vision of strong leadership and order appealed to some Italians who were frustrated by the constant political gridlock and violence associated with the years of lead, 1960s to 1980s, a period marked by political violence and terrorism from both far-left and far-right factions. Some Italians looked back at Mussolini's early years in power when he'd promised to restore order and stability, and felt that his approach was preferable to the instability of the modern political system. The ongoing debate about Mussolini's legacy is also reflected in Italy's public memory and historical debates. The way Mussolini and fascism are remembered in Italy has evolved over time. In the years immediately following World War II, Mussolini's memory was largely condemned, with public monuments to fascism being removed or destroyed, and Mussolini's regime being portrayed as a tragic episode in Italy's history. However, as the decades passed and Italy's political landscape became more complex, the question of how to remember Mussolini became more contentious. Some Italians began to view Mussolini as a man who had restored Italy's national pride and strength before the disastrous consequences of his alignment with Nazi Germany, while others continued to view him as a dictator whose regime led the country into ruin. In recent years, there has been renewed debate over the commemoration of Mussolini in Italy. Some towns and regions have sought to restore fascist monuments or honour Mussolini with statues and plaques, while others have strongly opposed these efforts, seeing them as a dangerous revival of fascist ideology. This debate reflects the continued tension in Italy over the legacy of fascism and Mussolini's place in the country's history. The question of how to remember Mussolini and his regime remains a highly sensitive issue, with no clear consensus emerging over how to deal with the past. Mussolini's legacy is also intertwined with the rise of right-wing populism and nationalist movements across Europe and the world. In recent years, as far-right political movements have gained ground in Italy and other European countries, Mussolini's ideas about nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism have resurfaced in some political discourse. While these movements do not directly call for a return to fascism, they have been influenced by Mussolini's emphasis on national pride, the rejection of liberal democracy, and the glorification of the nation-state. In conclusion, Mussolini's fascist legacy remains a deeply divisive and complex part of Italy's history. While his regime is generally seen as a period of national disgrace and devastation, there are still elements of his vision that continue to resonate in Italy's political life. The ongoing debate over how to deal with Mussolini's legacy, whether through the preservation or removal of fascist symbols or through the examination of his ideas in political discourse, continues to shape Italy's collective memory. Mussolini's rise to power, his fascist rule, and his eventual downfall serve as a reminder of the dangers of totalitarianism, nationalism, and the abuse of power in the quest for national greatness. Benito Mussolini's fascist regime was short-lived in comparison to other global political systems, but its influence on both Italian politics and the broader international community continues to be felt today. Despite the collapse of Mussolini's rule in 1945 and the eventual defeat of fascism in World War II, the ideas and legacies of his regime have remained an enduring point of reflection and contention, both in Italy and in the wider world. The era of fascism, under Mussolini's leadership, raised important questions about authoritarianism, nationalism, militarism, and the limits of power, questions that continue to resonate today in political discourse. In Italy, the post-war period saw the country grapple with the difficult task of rebuilding itself both physically and politically. Mussolini's fall left Italy divided, not just in terms of political ideology, but also in how the nation would define its identity moving forward. The fascist regime had sought to eliminate internal divisions and create a unified totalitarian state. But after Mussolini's death, Italy's transition to a democratic republic in 1946 was not without challenges. The country's history of fascism left a lasting imprint on political and cultural life. The long shadow of Mussolini's era could not be erased overnight. The Italian Republic that emerged after World War II was determined to leave behind the legacy of fascism. But the rise of neo-fascist groups in the years following Mussolini's execution indicated that his ideological influence did not dissipate immediately. In the 1950s and 1960s, far-right groups in Italy sought to resurrect the ideas of Mussolini's regime, advocating for authoritarian rule, nationalism, and an anti-communist agenda. The Italian Social Movement, MSI, which was founded in 1946, became the political vehicle for many of Mussolini's former supporters. While the MSI was never able to gain significant power in Italy's democratic political system, it nevertheless represented a continued faction within Italy that embraced Mussolini's vision of a strong authoritarian state. The post-war period also witnessed the development of a new political centre-left and centre-right in Italy, shaped in part by Mussolini's fascist legacy. Christian democracy, led by figures like Alcide de Gasperi, became the dominant political force in Italy, focusing on rebuilding the country's institutions in a way that rejected the totalitarianism of fascism while embracing the need for unity and national strength. On the left, the Italian Communist Party, PCI, which had played a major role in the resistance against Mussolini's regime, sought to create an Italy based on democratic socialism, standing firmly opposed to the resurgence of any fascist tendencies. Yet even in democratic Italy, the scars left by Mussolini's fascism were still evident. The years of lead, 1960s to 1980s, marked by political violence from both left-wing and right-wing extremist groups, were in part a response to Italy's unresolved issues with its fascist past. As radical political factions clashed over the future direction of Italy, Mussolini's legacy, both as a figure of admiration for some and as a symbol of oppression and war for others, continued to play a role in shaping Italy's political turmoil. Globally, Mussolini's fascist regime had a profound impact on the development of totalitarianism in the 20th century. Mussolini's fascist model inspired other authoritarian movements, including Franco's Spain and Salazar's Portugal, which embraced elements of fascist ideology and governance. Mussolini's rise to power also provided a blueprint for other dictators, including Adolf Hitler, who looked to Mussolini's fascist state as a guide for the rise of Nazi Germany. Mussolini's early support for militarism, nationalism, and the rejection of liberal democracy helped set the stage for the global struggles of the 20th century, including World War II. Mussolini's influence also extended beyond Europe. In Latin America, fascism inspired several authoritarian regimes, particularly in the years following World War II. Leaders in countries such as Argentina and Chile saw Mussolini's fascism as a way to create strong, centralized governments that could resist the threat of communism and create a sense of national unity. Fascist ideology found traction in parts of the political right across the globe, in places where the ideals of authoritarianism, military discipline, and nationalism were seen as solutions to instability. While Mussolini's direct influence waned after his execution, the themes of totalitarianism and nationalism that defined his rule continued to emerge in various political movements throughout the 20th century. The rise of far-right populism in Europe and the United States has revived some of the arguments Mussolini made about the need for strong leadership and state control over society. In recent years, some far-right political groups have sought to invoke Mussolini's legacy to promote nationalism, military might, and anti-immigrant policies, which are seen as attempts to restore national pride and power. However, the historical condemnation of fascism and Mussolini's authoritarianism has continued to shape contemporary politics, especially as democratic nations confront the dangers of populism and the rise of extremist movements. Mussolini's downfall serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the capacity for authoritarian regimes to lead countries into war and destruction. The legacy of his regime continues to remind the world of the potential for abuse of power when democratic institutions are undermined and personal liberties are sacrificed for the sake of national pride. Mussolini's impact on modern politics is therefore complex. While his fascist rule was ultimately defeated in 1945, the questions his regime raised about nationalism, power, and authority continue to reverberate through global politics. His legacy lives on, not only as a historical lesson about the dangers of unchecked political power, but also in the ongoing debates about nationalism, authoritarianism, and democracy in the 21st century. His life and rule remain a profound reminder of the potential consequences of fascism both for Italy and for the world. The life of Benito Mussolini, from his rise to power as the charismatic leader of fascist Italy to his brutal demise in 1945, serves as a complex and cautionary tale in the history of the 20th century. His legacy, deeply tied to the horrors of fascism, nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism, remains a subject of fierce debate. Mussolini's vision for Italy, one of strength, unity, and imperial glory, was shattered by his alliance with Nazi Germany and his failure to lead Italy through the tumultuous years of World War II. Despite his death, the repercussions of his regime are still felt today, not only in Italy, but across the world, as the ideals he promoted continue to resurface in the rhetoric of modern political movements. For many Italians, Mussolini's rise to power was a time of hope, as he promised national renewal after Italy's disillusionment following World War I. However, his dictatorial rule soon turned oppressive, with political dissent crushed, civil liberties stripped away, and Italy dragged into the disaster of World War II. The years of fascism left Italy divided, with the resistance fighting against Mussolini's regime, and many others continuing to support or sympathize with his fascist vision, even after the war. The difficult process of confronting and coming to terms with Mussolini's legacy is still ongoing in Italy today, as discussions about fascism, nationalism, and authoritarianism continue to shape the country's political climate. Globally, Mussolini's fascist experiment served as both a model and a warning. While other authoritarian leaders, such as Hitler, were inspired by Mussolini's tactics, the collapse of Mussolini's regime demonstrated the fragility of totalitarian rule when faced with military failure and internal dissent. Mussolini's alliance with Nazi Germany ultimately led Italy into a devastating conflict, which left the country shattered, economically impoverished, and politically divided. His legacy is often seen as one of tragedy, where his ambitions for an empire and a powerful Italy ended in ruin, not only for himself but also for his nation. In the modern era, Mussolini's fascism continues to be a subject of reflection and criticism. In Italy, neo-fascist movements occasionally attempt to resurrect Mussolini's ideas, though they remain on the margins of political life. The country's efforts to confront its past and move forward as a democratic republic remain a delicate balance of remembering the lessons of fascism while avoiding the risks of forgetting the horrors that Mussolini's rule caused. As the world confronts the rise of populist and authoritarian movements in contemporary politics, Mussolini's rule serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of nationalism, totalitarianism, and the erosion of democratic values. Mussolini's life, rule, and eventual downfall provide a powerful lesson in the dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of militarism, and the fragility of democratic institutions. The tragedy of fascism is not merely that it led to the destruction of Mussolini's Italy, but also that it left behind a legacy of fear, division, and suffering that would last long after his death. It is a reminder that history must not be forgotten, that the allure of authoritarianism may persist even after the fall of those who promote it, and that vigilance against the forces of oppression and totalitarianism is necessary to safeguard the future. In reflecting on Mussolini's legacy, we are left with an important question. How can we learn from history and ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated? Mussolini's rise to power and the tragedy of fascism should be a constant reminder of the need for strong democratic institutions, respect for individual freedoms, and the vigilance of citizens in maintaining their rights. Mussolini's story may have ended with his death, but the lessons of his rule continue to shape our understanding of the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of preserving democratic values for future generations. As we look back on Mussolini's life and his impact on Italy and the world, it is clear that the echoes of his regime will persist as long as we remember the lessons of his rise and fall. The legacy of fascism remains a warning, reminding us that unchecked power and extreme nationalism can lead to devastating consequences for a nation and the world.